You're listening to Stolen Princess, a Kilenya Chronicles story by Andrea Pearson. Copyright 2017, Andrea Pearson. Stolen Princess. Prince Dmitri pulled his sweat-lathered horse to a stop in the middle of the dusty road. He squinted in the hot August sunlight glaring past the city in front of him to the looming castle of Gevkin. The hunger he'd felt earlier now forgotten. He wrinkled his brow and pushed a strand of shoulder-length dark hair out of his eyes. Something felt different. Off. No, it was more than that. Something was wrong, and the sick feeling in the hollow of his stomach confirmed it. Kelson, his best friend, paused next to him, only looking at him briefly before facing the castle. "The men are coming?" Dmitri asked, referring to the group he and Kelson had been traveling with for several days. "Yes, you left in quite a hurry." King Roylance had sent Dmitri, his son-in-law, on a diplomatic mission to a southern kingdom where he and Kelson had negotiated the release of several Gevkin prisoners. The mission was a success, and Dmitri had been excited when it hadn't taken nearly as long as expected. He and the others had started home 2 days ago, eager to see their families again. Dmitri hesitated, urging his horse forward. He cleared his throat. I don't know, things aren't right." "I sense it too," Kelson said. Their eyes met, and Dmitri saw the worry he felt reflected on Kelson's face. They spurred their horses onward, racing toward the castle. Dmitri's heart pounded, increasing his nausea as he leaned over, wishing he was already there to protect his wife, the princess. Dust billowed up behind them, until moments later when the hooves hit the cobblestone streets of Myvoril city. People wailed on either side, some with their hands in the air, others clutching their chests. They called to Prince Dmitri, begging for assistance. Dmitri was only able to catch a few words here and there, but he heard enough repetitions of Princess Ariane to know that his instincts about his wife hadn't been off. The road took them out of the city and through the thick forest that surrounded the entire castle. Dmitri didn't hesitate as he raced around corners, ducking under overhanging tree branches, barely avoiding being whipped by the long stems. Finally, the trees cleared, and the magnificent castle where Dmitri had lived for the past several years towered above. Nothing looked out of place. The stained glass windows sparkled in the sunlight, and the statues in the gardens had been untouched. This didn't reassure Dmitri. He raced under the arch and pulled up next to the tall main doors, Kelson alongside him. They jumped off their horses as guards rushed out of the castle. A woman's cry sounded through the open door. "What happened?" Dmitri asked the head guard. "The castle was attacked and—" "What? By whom and when?" "An hour ago, followed by a shorter one moments before you arrived. We don't know who was behind them." Dmitri turned to Kelson and saw the same confusion there. Kelson shook his head, his blonde hair moving around his shoulders. Gevkin had no major enemies. "Unless—" "That's not all, Highness. The princess is gone." Dmitri's heart stopped beating. He felt the blood drain from his face. "No," he whispered, feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. It wasn't possible. He handed the reins to the nearest servant. "I'll take care of the horses," Kelson said. "Kelson, I need you with me." Dmitri tried to keep the worry from his voice for the guards' sakes, knowing that Kelson would definitely sense it. They'd been best friends since childhood. The guard had to be wrong. Dmitri would find Ariane safe in her room. Kelson nodded. Together, they dashed into the castle, skidding to a stop almost immediately. The calmness of the exterior had hidden the chaos of the interior. It was a disaster. Tapestries shredded, papers strewn about, furniture destroyed, and feathers falling through the air. The large hall clock had been smashed, parts of it littered across the floor. "This just barely happened," Kelson said. Cold sweat flooded down Dmitri's back and chest as it occurred to him that the guard could be right. The princess really was gone. "Ariane," he called, barely daring to think about what might have happened. "Ariane?" He'd known when he deserted his father to marry her that he'd made an enemy. But how deep did that hatred go? To wash a woman as she ran past? "Where is the princess?" The woman only shook her head in fright, and Dmitri released her. He and Kelson ran up several flights of stairs to the quarters Dmitri shared with his wife. They burst into the room. Nothing had been touched. The place was perfect. But there was no princess. Kelson grabbed Dmitri's shoulders. "Her handmaidens? I haven't seen any." His freckled face ashen, he gasped out one word, "Midian," then dashed from the room. Dmitri also left, but instead of following Kelson, he ran to the throne room. He slumped in relief when he saw the king there. At the sound of Dmitri's entrance, King Roylance looked up, his weathered and lined face wet from crying. Dmitri crossed the throne room in a few steps as Roylance wobbled out of the chair, legs barely holding him, and hung from his son-in-law's shirt. My girl is gone. You must find her." The room could have been crashing down around them and Dmitri wouldn't have noticed. His ears rang, his legs started shaking, his hands going numb. No, Arian couldn't be gone. She couldn't. Oh, his beautiful, precious wife. Dmitri's eyes roved the room trying to find something solid to hold to, desperate for anything that made sense, anything to take away the last few hours, to make things right again. Then they fell on the king, who stared at him with complete despair etched on his face. At that moment, Dmitri realized that one of them needed to be in control of his emotions. The king was already in a weakened state. It wouldn't be him who stepped up just yet. Dmitri took a deep, shuddering breath, pushing his panic aside. "I will," he said, responding to King Roylance's request. He steadied the elderly man, helping him back onto the throne, hoping the man wouldn't notice how his hands shook. "What happened?" "We were attacked. Didn't see it coming. Peace for so many years. Was my father behind it?" Roylance shook his head, dragging his hands down his face. "I don't know. It's possible." Dmitri squeezed the king's shoulder. "Don't worry. I promise. We'll find her." He bit his lip, watching the king, who, along with the queen, had been so ill the past several months. Having their daughter missing would definitely prolong their recovery. Dmitri stepped away, clasping his hands behind his back. "What has been done so far?" "The guards are on high patrol. Servants are finding all who are injured and are counting the dead and missing. We've sent scouts to follow the kidnappers, but have heard nothing. And Minyas are returning, reporting that the neighboring kingdoms are denying responsibility." Dmitri snorted. Of course they were. Just then, the door opened, and Aldo, one of the king's advisors, motioned for Dmitri to join him outside the room. Dmitri excused himself, wondering what the older man could have to say that the king shouldn't also hear. His mouth went dry. Aldo gently closed the door. "The king is gravely shaken by this, but he'll be fine. He'll watch over the castle. Dmitri, you must focus on finding Arian." Dmitri nodded. "It isn't just she who is missing. All her handmaidens are as well. Ezra and I are positive that her captors will demand ransom." Dmitri's thoughts rushed to Kelson. His wife, Midia, was one of Arian's handmaidens. "Where is Ezra?" "He's gone to our mother's cabin. We keep books, histories, and documents there. We have a few ideas, but aren't sure right now who it could be or why. More research is necessary." Dmitri shook his head in frustration. "Research? At a time like this? Why can't we just follow the captors? The scouts of this kingdom are the best." Aldo nodded. "Yes, we've sent scouts, but we haven't heard from them, even though it's been an hour since the initial attack." Dmitri slumped against the wall. Back in his father's kingdom, it wasn't unusual not to hear from someone for that long, but here, in Gevkin, they had Minyas, little creatures who delivered messages very quickly. If the scouts hadn't been heard from for that long, it was probably because they were dead or being held captive. There was always a reason. Aldo put his hand on Dmitri's shoulder. "Son, we won't be able to follow these captors as easily as we might have. This was a very well-planned attack. You and Kelson were gone, not expected to return for several more days. The king and queen are sick, and Arian is pregnant. Ezra and I were in Mavril City, investigating another problem. and the attackers knew all this. Aldo's grey eyes peered at Dmitri with concern, the sides of his frizzy white hair at his usual puff around his balding head. He squeezed Dmitri's shoulder before dropping his hand. "Things will be fine. In the long run, I feel it. But I'm afraid our suffering won't be over for a while." Dmitri slumped. Aldo and his twin brother Ezra had proven themselves to be intelligent and insightful, never far from the mark with their intuition. Dmitri blinked back tears that formed in his eyes. Arian, oh Arian, 8 months pregnant with their first child, a child which had taken years to conceive, and she'd already struggled so much during this pregnancy, unable to leave her bed most days, very sick every day. "What is to be done? What can I do?" "Give us 2 hours, then meet us at our mother's cottage." Outwardly, Dmitri agreed, but inwardly his heart chafed at waiting 2 hours. When the time had nearly passed, a servant saddled Dmitri's horse, and he galloped to the cabin. It was tucked in the forest, away from the road between the castle and Maveril city. As he pulled in closer, he knew right away something was wrong. The outside was fine, but a feeling in the air spoke of recent violence. Warily, he dropped to the ground and tethered his horse to a tree near the porch. A rolling feeling in the pit of his stomach hit him. Senses heightened, he listened for the sound of intruders. Cautiously, quietly, he pulled his sword and edged toward the cabin. He stepped onto the wooden porch and cringed when the boards creaked. Dmitri paused. Nothing happened. Pushing the door open with his sword, he walked closer to the threshold. Waited again, then peered into the cabin. The place had been ransacked, walls torn down with wallpaper everywhere, furniture mutilated, floorboards ripped up. It appeared to be empty. "Hello?" No answer. He took a step inside and noticed a pool of blood near a pile of fallen wallpaper. Jumping to it, he lifted the paper and gasped. Ezra was underneath, eyes staring forward, mouth hanging open, blood trickling at the corner. Was he dead? This had barely happened. The blood was fresh. Dmitri grabbed the man's wrist, feeling for a pulse. Nothing. How would Arion take this? Arion? Dmitri pushed the strong feelings aside, noticing a crumpled-up piece of paper in the elderly man's hand and pulling it free. A sudden noise behind him made him whirl. A dark shadow crossed in front of the cabin. Dmitri lifted his sword. "Who's there?" He advanced toward the door. "Show yourself." He sprang onto the porch. The surrounding forest and road were empty. He circled the entire cabin, following a shadow, but saw nothing concrete. What was going on? His horse looked thoroughly spooked, though, and Dmitri knew he'd not been mistaken. Something or someone had been out there, and where was Aldo? Dmitri briefly looked through the cabin, ensuring it was indeed empty, then pulled himself into the saddle, finally remembering the note still clutched in his hand. It was written in Ezra's script. Lorcan behind attack? Motive? Pregnant? Fury of the elements. Dmitri frowned. What was a Lorcan, and what did Arian's pregnancy have to do with anything? He needed King Roylance's opinion. Needing to report Ezra's death, he turned the horse around and galloped back to the castle, watching over his shoulder for anyone following. Fury of the elements could be anything, really, King Roylance said, holding Ezra's note as Dmitri paced in front of him. The king had calmed down when presented with a puzzle, and Dmitri didn't blame him. It gave them something to work over. He looked up at Dmitri, rubbing his chin. "And I think I've heard the words Lorcan before, but I'm not sure where." Dmitri stopped pacing for a moment. Why would Arian's pregnancy have anything to do with it? King Roylance shook his head. "I worry it's because her kidnappers understand how important my daughter and her unborn child are to you. They've exploited your love and the trials the two of you went through to have a baby." Dmitri slumped on the steps near the throne, putting his face in his hands. "If anything happens," Royd laughed, "I don't know what to think." He ran his fingers through his hair. "And I really need to go back to the cabin, search it more thoroughly." Roydance nodded. "Yes, that would be wise. He snapped his fingers, and a servant approached. "Please tell the group retrieving Ezra's body not to disturb anything in the cabin." The man nodded, then rushed from the room, and the king turned to Dmitri. "Yes, return to the cabin. Conduct a more in-depth search." Dmitri nodded. He realized he hadn't eaten in many hours, so he took a break to do that while waiting for his horse to be readied. After finishing, he pulled his journal out and completed an entry from earlier, knowing the writing would help him clear his mind and keep his emotions under control. He wondered where Kelson had gone. He could really use his best friend's help right then. It only took a couple of minutes for Dmitri to arrive on horseback at the cabin. The men were just leaving, carrying Ezra's stiff body. Waves of sadness threatened to engulf Dmitri at the sight of the elderly man, but again he pushed them aside. There would be time for mourning later. He jumped from his horse and strode to the door of the cabin, only hesitating a moment before entering. The chaos greeted him almost cheerfully. Sunshine flooded through the front room's 2 windows, and now that the dust had settled, the familiar smells of the twins' mother were again on the air. Spiced apple and pumpkin. Her specialities, before she'd passed away half a year ago. Dmitri started in the front room, not sure what he would find, if anything, but he was surprised when, right away, he discovered a letter addressed to him. It had been placed on top of an overturned table near the main door. Dmitri frowned. It hadn't been there earlier. He quickly read the note. It was written by Aldo. He must have come and gone during the time Dmitri hadn't been there. How had he taken the news of his brother's death? The note was short, instructing Dmitri to go to the nearest caith tree for further instructions. Dmitri did so, tethering his horse to a post across the way from the gnarled, leafless tree. He strode forward, pausing when an unseen force stopped him. He was nearly blinded when a bright light flashed from the tree. He waited patiently as the light flooded over him, giving the magic of the tree an opportunity to verify his identity. Only he would be able to access whatever it was that Aldo had left. The light dissipated, and the force that stopped him lifted, allowing him to walk forward. He remembered how foreign the idea of using a tree to secure valuables or messages had been when he'd first arrived in Gevkin several years earlier. His father, King of Trusenal, hadn't permitted such things. There was a hole in the tree trunk, about chest high. Dmitri put his hand into this hole and felt around, his fingers closing on a piece of paper. It was a full-page letter from Aldo. Dmitri scanned through it for the important information. The attack wasn't led by King Romantis, Dmitri's father, as he'd suspected. Instead, a group of evil, non-human beings called Lorcon had kidnapped the princess. Aldo instructed Dmitri to choose companions of varying ability for a dangerous quest to rescue the princess. She was being held in the land of the Shengols. Deciding to read the rest of the note later with the king, Dmitri pocketed it, then quickly returned to the throne room. Kelson waited near the door and joined Dmitri by the king. "Aldo wasn't there, but I found this." Dmitri handed the first note to King Roylance, "which led me to this." He gave the king the letter. Roydens read both papers and looked up. "You must do as he says, and hurry. The sooner you leave, the faster we'll find my child." Dmitri nodded, but Kelson looked skeptical. "I know you appreciate Aldo, but is he trustworthy? He went to the cabin ahead of Dmitri and wasn't there when Dmitri arrived and found Ezra dead. Aldo returned to put a letter in place and again didn't wait for Dmitri. And he's leading him away from Maviril city. What if he's behind the attack?" King Roylance didn't respond at first. He frowned, obviously thinking over Kelson's question, then shook his head. "No. Aldo is a brother to me. Not once has he done anything to disprove himself in the past 65 years. We must not allow fear to tear us from those who have proven themselves loyal over and over again." Kelson nodded. It appeared he accepted the king's response. Either that, or he realized that arguing wouldn't do any good. Dmitri took a breath, wanting to change the subject. He didn't feel comfortable questioning Aldo either. The man had been a wonderful help since Dmitri had arrived in Gevkin, and Ariane was very attached to him. "How is the queen?" A grave expression crossed the king's face. "Not well at all, and I'm afraid she won't last much longer." He rubbed his eyes, then looked up at Dmitri. "Who do you think you'll take with you?" "Kelson to start with. Of course, he's a trusted friend and ally." Dmitri nodded, looking at his best friend. "And he knows many good men here." "Yes, I'll help find others. How about Brend and his brother Ferron?" "Great idea," Dmitri said. "Both are excellent." The king rubbed his beard. "Have you thought of taking a Makalo?" Dmitri shrugged. "Not really." His father hated Makalos. He thought they were lazy, short, and annoying creatures. Dmitri had met his first Makalo, Kenji, several years ago when he'd first come to Gevkin, and hadn't found him to be anything like what his father had implied. Quite the opposite. He was hard-working, knowledgeable, and friendly, and the rest of the Makalos seemed to be the same. Of course, Dmitri's father had been correct about one thing. Makalos were short. They were only about 4 feet tall. "Is there one you'd be comfortable with? They'll make the way much easier with their magic." Dmitri nodded. "Yes. I'll have Kenji come. He's young but reliable." He glanced at his friend. "Kelson, aside from Ferron and Brend, I'll let you and Kenji choose. Who else will come? I'll get a list of men to you by tonight." The king leaned back in the throne. If the queen were here right now, she'd suggest taking a Shengol for protection, guidance, and wisdom. It would ensure a successful and safe trip, if you could convince one to accompany you. "Yes, very true," Dmitri said, slowly nodding. The Shengols had always intimidated him, though. They were powerful, magical, and exceptionally moody. But the king was right. Their abilities and understandings would put Dmitri way ahead of the Lorcom. He snapped his fingers. A servant approached, and Dmitri asked the man to deliver a request to the Shengols in Mavril City for an audience with King Roylance. Hopefully one of them, any of them, would honor that request. Dmitri took a deep breath. "We're in need of Eminia still." Kelson smiled. "You're sure you trust one enough to come?" Dmitri rolled his eyes. Kelson knew he couldn't stand the tiny creatures, regardless of how effective they were at delivering messages. He'd always found them to be impertinent and annoying. "We don't have a choice. It's either that or not maintain communication with the castle." "Why don't you take Arian's Minya?" the king asked. "She hates me, and I can't even remember her name." The king and Kelson chuckled. "I'll take care of that," Kelson said. "A grouchy Minya is better than no Minya." Dmitri watched as Kelson finished tightening the saddle straps on his horse. "This is a great group we've got here," Kelson said. 11 in all, 6 humans, 5 Makalos. We'll quickly catch up with these things called Lorcan." Dmitri nodded. "That's what I'm hoping." He glanced at the others. All had been affected by the Lorcan attack in one way or another, including 2 who had lost loved ones to death. Dmitri struggled to put aside the feeling of despair that crept up from his stomach into his chest. What if they didn't find the women? What if Arian was lost forever? "Cheer up, Your Highness," Kelson said, apparently sensing the prince's emotions. "We'll come out conquerors, regardless of these snares the Lorcans have set." Dmitri put his arm across his best friend's shoulders. "I have no doubt we will, and as long as you are around to keep us energetic and positive, we'll succeed." Kelson chuckled in response, and Dmitri decided to meet the members of their team. He walked around, shaking hands and thanking the others for their willingness to come. He wished they'd been able to find a Shengol, but none had responded to the call. Must have been because of the last-minute notice. Shengols were so temperamental. Another blow had come in the form of Ferron, Bren's brother, and one of the best members of the King's Guard. No one could find him anywhere, not even a body after the attack. Dmitri got to Kenji last. The Makalo's face was a little below Dmitri's eye level, even while Kenji sat on his pony. He smiled at Dmitri, extending his hand. "I'm grateful you asked me to come," he said. "I was planning to volunteer, but you got to it first." Dmitri chuckled. "We'll definitely use your services, especially your understanding of medical things." Kenji looked down, flushing. I understand little compared to the older Makalos, but I'll do my best. At least I can help you know when there's danger in the area. Search for energy cords, for remnants of electricity. Dmitri raised his eyebrows. Really? How? My resend, Kenji said, lifting his left hand. As was typical for Makalos, his ring finger glowed a faint blue. I can sense living things in the surrounding area when my finger comes in contact with trees. Dmitri folded his arms and mock glared at the Makalo. I've known of Redzon since coming here, and you never told me of this ability. He smiled, to show he was teasing. Kenji shrugged, his cheeks turning red. I'm sorry. I just never thought to bring it up before. I forget how much you don't know of Makalos. It's fairly common knowledge. Dmitri sighed, wishing yet again that his father had allowed the smaller creatures into his kingdom. Thank you for telling me. I'm sure I'll use that ability frequently. He turned to the rest of the group and raised his voice. We need to be on our way. Dmitri sighed. Just then, King Roylance shuffled through the front doors of the castle, a guard at his side carrying Queen Aralise. Dmitri hadn't seen the queen in weeks, and he had to cover his shock at how far her condition had gone. She was so frail. She couldn't weigh more than 80 pounds. Her skin was grey. Her usual bright eyes and smile dampened. She held out her arms for Dmitri and pulled him in for a hug. Her voice quivered. Find my daughter, please. But above all, take care of yourself. I couldn't bear to lose both of you. King Roylance gave his well wishes and a final blessing for a safe trip, then waved goodbye as the group pulled away. Dmitri looked back, nodding one last time to the king and queen before the thick forest obstructed his view of the castle. The feelings of despair from earlier nearly overcame him, and he thought of sob rising in his throat as he thought of Arian and her beloved parents. They're not looking well, Kelson said. Dmitri shook his head, blinking back tears. Not at all. He cleared his throat. I'm afraid Queen Aralise won't last much longer. The two friends rode in silence, and Dmitri took the opportunity to regain his composure. When he was sure he could talk without his voice faltering, he glanced around. So, where's that Minya? Kelson snorted. Who knows? Pillaging an innocent town, probably. Dmitri pulled a handful of dandelion seeds from his saddlebag, whispered into them, then blew them away. You're calling for her? Is it possible you've learned her name? Whose? The Minyas? Not a chance. I asked for a sour old messenger. She'll know I'm talking about her. Gilson chuckled, shaking his head. A few minutes later, a plump, 2-inch-tall, wingless, human-like creature floated to Dmitri. She didn't direct her grumpy expression at him, but stared in the air somewhere above his head. What you want? Dmitri clenched his fists, fighting to ignore her insolent attitude. Contact the Mikalo Patriarch and find out what he's heard about the attack. See if he knows anything concerning these Lorcon. The Minya drifted away. Dmitri smirked. Let's see how long she takes this time, shall we? I could always take over, communicate with her instead of you doing it. We can try that, if you think it'll do any good. Kelson nodded. It may. The Minya returned only seconds later. I can't get to him. Why? Kelson asked. She just shrugged and flitted past them. Dmitri shook his head. Dumb thing. Nearly half a mile from the lake, Dmitri noticed something odd about the air in front of them. As the group got closer, he motioned for everyone to stop. Something shimmered between them and the lake. Something big, stretching from one side of the valley to the other. You see that? Dmitri asked Kelson. Yes, Kelson said, squinting in the sunlight. What is it? Bren pulled his horse up alongside Dmitri and Kelson. With your permission, Highness, I'll ride ahead to inspect. Dmitri waved the man forward, and the rest of the group waited, anxious to understand the phenomenon. It didn't take long before Bren's horse panicked, bucking, dashing forward, jumping, shaking its head. And the poor creature wasn't the only thing suffering. Bren clutched at his face and throat, coughing and gagging. Pull them back, Dmitri yelled. "Pull them back!" Kelson spurred forward but was nearly bucked off when Bren's horse screamed. Kelson's horse wouldn't let him get any closer. Dmitri jumped down, threw his reins to the nearest person, and ran forward on foot. Without hesitation, he plunged into the shimmering air. A cold, wet feeling instantly spread across his entire body, and an intense pressure covered every inch of him. The compression was so great, it felt like he'd fallen into the bottom of an ocean. Trusting his instinct to hold his breath, eyes burning, he strained forward. Dmitri reached Bren's horse and grabbed his reins. He dragged the animal around, still holding his breath, afraid of what would happen if he tried to take in air. Dmitri tugged on the leather straps, his muscles straining from exertion and lack of oxygen. The horse barely moved an inch. Dmitri narrowed his eyes, pulling harder, then felt someone touch his shoulder. Kelson grabbed hold of the reins, and together they pulled. The horse moved several more inches. Suppressing a growl of frustration, Dmitri made eye contact with Kelson, motioned for him to pull, then counted down from 3 with his fingers. They heaved. Again, only a few inches of ground were gained. Dmitri's chest was on fire, his throat begging him to breathe. They were joined by several other men, who pushed from behind, while another pulled Bren from the horse. Finally, just when Dmitri's vision started to fade, he and the rest struggled out of the shimmering air. The intense pressure released and the wet feeling left. Dmitri coughed, breathing hard. The oxygen felt like it ripped through him to get to his lungs and brain again. The horse fell to its knees, then toppled over, and Kelson jumped to help it. Dmitri turned his attention to Brent. He rolled the man to his stomach and thumped him on the back, joined by Kenji, who helped support Brent's head. After several seconds, Brent gagged and spluttered, struggling against Dmitri and Kenji. They released him and stepped back. He relaxed, pulling himself into a sitting position. "I'm fine. I'm fine." "Water, Your Highness," Kenji said. "He needs some?" "No, he was in water." "He's drowning," Dmitri asked, knowing that what Kenji said was true. "But how is this possible?" "It's the first element, it must be. Brend is incredibly lucky not to have drowned." After ensuring that Brend and the horse would be all right, Dmitri got up and walked back to the shimmering air, stopping just before it. How did this come to be, and what exactly is it? He put his hand into the iridescent air. He was shocked by the feeling of water falling over it and his arm. His skin didn't appear to be wet, however, and he raised an eyebrow. Kelson joined him. "A magical waterfall." "It stopped me," Arias Minya said right next to Dmitri. He resisted the urge to swat her away, turning instead to face the group. "Men, spread out. Search for the edges," he instructed the Minya to find the top of the waterfall. Ren got up to follow the others, but Dmitri gently pushed him back down. "You need to rest. You nearly died." An hour later, everyone had all returned. They couldn't find anything. Brend attempted to stand again. "My lord, I've already been in it. If you like, I'll see if I can find out how thick it is." "No, I won't have anyone risking their lives again. Last time you went plenty far enough. This won't be a small barrier, and we can't afford to lose men." "How shall we get through?" someone asked. "Are we sure there even is a way?" another of the men asked. Dmitri nodded. "I'm positive the Lorcan left one." He strode to his horse and pulled himself up, nudging her to the water. He nearly fell off when she reared up, nostrils flaring, the whites of her eyes flashing. Dmitri clung to her until she'd calmed down, speaking to her in soothing tones, patting her neck. When she was ready, he turned her so her side was near the waterfall, getting him close enough to put his hand back into the shimmering air. "I wonder." He looked over his shoulder. "Kelson, you go in that direction." He pointed opposite from where he faced. "I'll go this way. Keep your hand in the water and call if you feel a break." Kelson nodded, and Dmitri put his hand in the waterfall again. The change in temperature was only slightly noticeable, but it was enough. He nudged his horse forward, entering the forest that lined both sides of the road. The going was slow. After only a couple of moments, he found that his skin adjusted to the coolness, and he had to twist and put the other hand in as he continued. As the trees grew closer together, crowding man and horse to the water, Dmitri found it increasingly difficult to continue. He considered going forward on foot, but decided against it, since making sure his hand was still in the water took too much concentration. Instead, he loosened her reins, letting her pick her way. Half a mile later, Dmitri gasped when the water ended. He double, then triple-checked it, wanting to be sure his mind wasn't playing tricks on him. Sure enough, the magical waterfall disappeared for 6 feet before starting up again. Wonderful. Hello? Dmitri called over his shoulder. I think I found something. Everyone, come. Deciding not to move lest he lose the spot, he waited for the others to catch up. The Lorcon had chosen the location of their tunnel well. There was about 20 feet of a break in the forest near the entrance, allowing his entire group to assemble around him. When the others arrived, Dmitri showed them the pause in water. Tunnel, Kenji said. Dmitri scanned the group. Kelson. He's on his way, Lord, Brent said. Right, let's take a break and eat when he arrives. Kelson returned and pulled food from his saddlebags, which he passed around. Dmitri leaned against a large rock, quietly eating his meal, listening to the others. He smiled at their excitement, finding the tunnel had recharged their spirits. Dmitri took a deep breath and surveyed the break in the waterfall. He couldn't tell how tall it was, but figured they'd be able to ride through. He tilted his head, thinking of the possible problems they'd encounter while doing that, though. How would the horses react? The path wouldn't go straight through the water, he was sure of that. Too easy. Would the men have to lead their horses, or would riding suffice? Only one way to find out. He stood and untethered his horse. Everyone ready. The men gathered their things, then followed as Dmitri rode into the tunnel, instinctively holding his breath. His horse was jumpy at first, as was to be expected, but seemed to do fine after several moments. He exhaled in relief. The first thing Dmitri noticed, aside from the wavy and distorted sunlight, was how cold it was in the tunnel compared to the hot August weather of outside. He pulled his cloak closer around him. The next thing he noticed was that the place definitely smelled of water. After a few minutes, the smell began to make him feel claustrophobic. Every breath he took was dirty and stale. Dmitri put his concentration on the path. At first, he kept his hand in the water, trying to anticipate turns before they came, but his horse seemed to know where to go, and after a couple of turns he pulled his hand back. The others followed easily. What felt like an hour later, when he was about to pass out from taking shallow breaths against the stench, they left the tunnel. Dmitri breathed a sigh of relief and hopped down to stretch, enjoying the feel of the sun on his face once again. It took a while for the rest of the group to make it through, and the sun wasn't far from setting when everyone had emerged. Let's set up camp here, Dmitri said, pointing to a level area near the lake. He motioned for Kelson to join him. Have Arians Minya go back through the tunnel and deliver a message to the castle, telling them that we're safe. Kelson nodded, and Dmitri turned to his horse, pulling his things from her bags. The day had been long, most of it spent searching for a tunnel through the waterfall, and the rest of it waiting for everyone to come through. He couldn't wait to get to sleep. We've got a problem, Kelson said, returning. Arians Minyet can't get back through the tunnel even when I showed her its location. What? How is that possible? Kelson shrugged. Her magic won't allow her to do it. Dmitri growled, running his hand through his hair. What have these Lorcans done to prevent her access? But more importantly, how will we communicate with the king and queen? Dmitri made sure to spend time getting to know the men, thanking them once again for coming. Then he organized a watch for every hour. He'd take his turn at 3 and Kelson at 4. Kelson and Dmitri set up the large, sturdy tent they'd be sharing. They cooked their supper meal together, then settled back against the stiff wall of the tent, relaxing. Sansa looked at them with wondering eyes. Who did you leave your son with? Dmitri asked. Bren's family. He and Bren's youngest play together regularly. It seemed the least disruptive for him. Dmitri nodded. That's important. What did you tell the child about his mother? Just that she was gone for a while. I didn't know what else to say that he'd understand. Neither spoke for a while, and Dmitri picked at the rest of his food. Kelson put his plate down. Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if we hadn't left Truzinol? Sometimes I try not to think about the first part of my life too much. It's depressing. Still, it's been so long, and even longer since your mother died. Dmitri sighed. Kelson had a point, but regardless of how much time had passed or how much good he'd done, nothing would undo the scars and memories of the actions of his younger years. Some things can never be fully erased, Kelson, and I feel like if I were to completely move on, forgive myself, it would void everything I've done since then to right the wrongs. He paused, staring at a small rock on the ground in front of him, then continued in a whisper. And I'll never be able to repay any of it. Not to the people. They're gone. Nothing I do will fix that. Surely, though, you realize you deserve peace. There has to be an end to your suffering and guilt. And in your defense, you were only following your father's example, only carrying out his orders. Dmitri shook his head. I knew what I was doing wasn't good. It always felt that way, unclean. I ignored the feeling of self-disgust each time I killed someone innocent, regardless of why I was doing it. He fiddled with his cuffs, folding and unfolding them, making sure the crease was as crisp as possible each time. And the why, obeying my father, doesn't matter. Not really. Kelson didn't respond for a moment. You befriended me, don't forget that. It wasn't the other way around. Dmitri laughed. True, you wouldn't have dared speak first. Kelson snorted. Me? A palace stable boy? I should think not. If you'd been having a bad day, you would have had my head removed. He grinned, then quieted. Why did you trust me? No, sure. I just did. And it proved to be the only wise move I made before my 18th birthday. Which was when your mother cornered you, right? Talked to you about your choices? Dmitri nodded, chuckling again. She was pretty straightforward. Kelson rested his chin on his hands, staring into the dying fire. A more angelic person never existed. True. Dmitri put his plate next to Kelson's, pondering his mother. She was perfect, he'd grown sure of that, as he'd seen her quiet background efforts to right his father's wrongs. He'd been surrounded by filth, but his mother's grace had been brightest in the end. She suffered so much affliction without ever a negative word, always lifting others, even in death, a death that could so easily have been prevented if the king wanted. She always approved of my friendship with you. Dmitri looked up. Did I ever tell you that? No, you didn't. The only thing I knew was how mad it made your father to have his heir apparent spending so much time with a servant. You were such a rebellious teenager. Me? Rebellious? Ha! If I hadn't been so wonderful in his eyes, he would never have chosen me to become the next king. Have you gotten word from Truzinol lately? Not since my last supporters said she'd been discovered. I'm sure she's dead now. Dmitri's heart hurt at the thought. Pause in the conversation. Dmitri decided it was time to get some sleep. They cleaned up dinner, put out the fire, and went to bed. The following morning, Dmitri pushed aside the night of troubling dreams he'd had and sent Ariane's Minya to the Makalau patriarch, who, thankfully, wasn't in Myvoril city. After camp had been set up, she finally returned with a message. The patriarch says he's determined to find out who the Lorcon are and why they've never been seen in Eclaron before. Dmitri shook his head. We need to destroy these beasts, remove them from the land, before we worry so much about where they originated. Let the patriarch know how much we need his help in getting rid of them first. After that, we can focus on getting more information. With a flash, she disappeared, then returned moments later. He said he feels just as strongly as you regarding the necessity of removing the threat of these creatures. He's been watching them, and they've gathered a huge army. Preparations for war. The Makalaus will be sending forces to assist you. Dmitri's shoulders tensed. War? The Lorcan wanted war? He turned to his men, instructing them to gather their things. It was time to head out. Dmitri and the rest settled into a comfortable trot. As comfortable as a trot could be, anyway. But Kelson had urged Dmitri not to push the horses too hard, and Dmitri felt walking was too slow. He understood Kelson's reasoning, however. It would take a few days to reach Arian, and if the horses failed to get that far, the group would be stranded. After checking on the others, Kelson caught up to Dmitri. "Morale is high." Dmitri chuckled. "We haven't been gone that long, Kelson." I know, but it doesn't hurt to resolve things ahead of time." Dmitri agreed. They were joined just then by Kenji, who wanted to know if they'd heard from the Patriarch yet. "Yes, we have," Dmitri said. He relayed the Patriarch's words from earlier. "And I'm not ready for war." "Are we ever?" Kenji asked. "Those of us who don't seek blood?" Neither men answered the Makalo, and they rode in silence for several moments, contemplating Kenji's question. After a minute, Kenji took a deep breath. "Ah," he said, sighing. "Do you smell that?" "Yes," Kelson said. "It's glorious." Dmitri nodded, smiling. "I can smell Arian's perfume. She must be near," he whispered. Kelson stared at the prince. He shook his head. "No, it's not Arian. It's the soups and breads my mother used to make, which is curious since she's been gone for years." Kenji frowned. "But I smell maple, mountains, and pine needles." Dmitri chuckled, a complacent, comfortable feeling cascading over him. The last thing he wanted at that moment was to argue with his friends. "Well, whatever it is, it's absolutely wonderful." Kelson and Kenji agreed, and they followed the trail as it led them through a small village and close to a large mountain range, Dunsani Mountain. Dmitri knew he should be more alert, but he didn't want to shatter the peace now filling his heart. Arian was nearby, and she was wearing his favorite perfume. He breathed deeply, memories of their courtship filling his mind. She was so perfect. Nothing she ever did was wrong. Back when he first met her, that had been a problem. He'd scoffed at the idea of someday marrying her, or even someone remotely like her. "She's a complete bore, Mother," he'd said. "I'd never have any fun, and I highly doubt she'd approve of my types of activities anyway." He had turned to look at the Queen. "Are you sure there isn't anyone else?" "Of course there are others, plenty, but Princess Arian is the only." She'd hesitated. "Attractive, one your father doesn't approve of." He smiled at the way she said the word attractive. At least she'd agreed that he couldn't marry a woman he found unappealing. "I still don't understand why father's approval is such a horrible thing." She shrugged. "You will, someday." She took Dmitri's arm and they strolled away from the garden bench where they'd been sitting. "Why don't you at least try to get to know the princess? She may surprise you." He grumbled, but after some teasing from his mother, he finally consented. Then an idea had formed in his mind. He'd test Arian, see how much she'd allow him to do. He'd grinned, formulating a plan to ask her to meet him secretly in the woods near his father's castle. Not only would it require her to travel far to see him, but they'd be completely alone. The grin spread as he thought through the letter he'd write to her. He was surprised a couple days later when he received her response. She was actually favorable to meeting on his terms. How was that possible? Someone of her upbringing surely recognized the warnings, but she hadn't requested a single change in the arrangement. Why? When that night arrived, she shocked him by completely putting him in his place with a quiet determination that disarmed him. The smell of her perfume, so strong in Dmitri's nose now, had made him weak in the knees, and the desire to be close to her, to do her bidding, nearly overpowered him. "I know what you are," she'd said. He cleared his throat, ignoring the temptation to wrap his arms around her. She would fall for him, not the other way around. "Oh? And what is that?" "And I know your plans. Prince Dmitri, my mother wholly trusts your mother. She believes Queen Edita can help you find the good within, that you will be prepared to treat me the way I deserve by the time the wedding comes." She turned away, her voice softening. "I agree. There's something about you, something honest and clean, though you try to hide it behind disgusting actions. I'm prepared to wait as long as necessary for you to figure yourself out." She'd turned and kissed him on the cheek, her perfume swirling around them, making him temporarily unable to think. Then she got back in her carriage and departed. Dmitri watched her go, a hand on his face where he still felt her lips. He wasn't even angry that his plan had completely failed. A sensation he'd never experienced before flooded over him. Suddenly, he felt like his heart no longer belonged to himself, as if it had left with the princess, and he knew that no matter what happened, no matter how his father responded, he'd do everything in his power to become the man Arion deserved. Years, tribulation and tears later, he realized it would take more than a beautiful and honest girl to reverse his acts and crimes. He'd quickly forgotten the resolve of that night, and if it hadn't been for his mother, he never would have fully changed. Dmitri smiled, raising his face to the sun, again enjoying the smells of his wife's perfume. He and the others hadn't had any problems for a long time, hours, and they wouldn't. He knew they wouldn't. Things would go smoothly until they found their women again. He let his horse follow the trail on its own as he slumped in the saddle, relaxing, enjoying memories of his sweet Arion. After several hours of blissful riding, Dmitri felt a strong hand grab his arm and try to pull him from the horse. He sighed, ignoring the tug. It would go away, just like his stress had. But the tug got insistent, the grip strengthening. Dmitri fell completely out of the saddle. He was unable to resist, as his limp body was dragged across the ground. He couldn't even turn far enough to see who'd pulled him. His thoughts were muddled. What had he been doing? Why was he out here and not back at the castle with his beautiful wife? Ah, Arion, he smiled, remembering her face. Just then, frigid water splashed over his head, slopping down his back and soaking his nose, eyes, mouth and ears. He gasped and sputtered, frantically wiping the water away. Someone huge loomed over him, and his first instinct was to pull out his sword and strike. But then recognition entered his hazy mind. The fat lady, Arion and Queen Aralise's long-time friend. She pulled him to his feet and gave him a moment to collect himself. He cleared his face of the water while taking the opportunity to adjust to her enormous size. Well over 6 feet tall and at least 500 pounds, with plenty of speed and energy. She intimidated many people. She laughed. "Prince Dmitri, what you doing?" "Trying to." Dmitri coughed up the water still in his lungs. The fat lady chuckled. "Sorry about that. It was necessary. You weren't going anywhere." Dmitri frowned, staring at her. "Yes, we were." He glanced around them, surprised to see that they were just outside her cabin. "But I don't understand. We should have been hours away from here by now." "You weren't? I'd been watching. You hadn't gone anywhere in a while. Sorry it took so long. I lassoed you with rope before figuring out I had stuff on hand to make a potion to prevent the Lorcon spell from hitting me too." "Potion? Spell? What spell?" "That one." The fat lady walked him around a large tree and pointed back to the trail. Dmitri gasped at what he saw. His entire group was standing there, not doing anything, and they weren't on their horses anymore. How was that possible? The group should have been miles away. "Where are the horses?" he asked. "Oh, they wandered off, not too far. We'll find them. Animals apparently don't much care for the potions the Lorcon use. But that's good, because I don't think I would have been able to pull you and your horse out." "How did the horses get away when we hadn't dismounted?" The fat lady shrugged. "Not sure." She looked at the prince. "Are you ready? Let's go get the rest." It took over an hour for the fat lady to drag everyone out of the Lorcan's trap. She had Dmitri wait at the edge with the water. He hated making her do the hard work, but she argued when he'd suggested he pull the people. Her point was valid. He'd just get stuck again. Once everyone was safely around her cabin, Dmitri turned to her. "How do we get some of that potion you took?" She shook her head. "You don't. I use the last of my ingredients, and it takes months to get new stuff. No, you'll have to go on without it. From what I've heard, though, you shouldn't have more problems with potions like that again, mainly because the last 2 elements are very different from this one." "You know about all this?" Dmitri asked. "The last 2?" Kelson asked. "Was this an element?" The fat lady nodded, settling down on the steps of her cabin. Yes, it represents wind. The Lorcan created a spell, a potion, which won't fade with time, and they placed it in thick concentrations around that section of the path. From what I've gathered by watching you and conversing with Aldo, it confounds the minds of the people who enter it, rendering them completely helpless. You thought you were continuing on with your lives, right? The group nodded. But you weren't. It's an invisible prison. You would have been there for an awfully long time if I hadn't pulled you out. She tucked a strand of mouse-brown hair into a small sloppy bun on the top of her head. So, you've already discovered water and wind. Fire is next. Fire? Kenji said. Great. Is in the form of a person, a fire pulsar named Lucia, to be exact. Dmitri groaned. A fire pulsar? I've heard awful things about them. How are we to defeat one? You won't need to fight her. Just bypass the area where she's chained. And I can help you with that. She searched the air. Where's your Minya? Huh? Dmitri shrugged. Who knows? She never sticks around. Well, when the time comes, make sure you always keep one near you. They have a natural sensitivity to temperature change, even very minute ones. He or she will be able to alert you to each fire pulse right before it comes. That will give you a chance to take cover as you're approaching Lucia. She paused until Dmitri nodded, showing he understood. Next, only 2 of you should go at a time. If unsuccessful, another 2 will attempt it and interacting with. The fat lady waved her hand. The chances of finding cover that'll protect more than that is unlikely, and going alone is unwise. She leaned forward. But don't worry. This isn't exactly difficult. All you have to do, once you're close enough, is to space these diamonds evenly around the fire pulsar. She dug into a pocket of her pants, pulling out a handful of diamonds. Make sure they're no closer than 10 feet, and nothing can come between them. Dmitri took the diamonds. They weren't spectacular, 1/2 inch in diameter, too yellow in color to be valuable, and not cut to be worn as jewelry. Each had a hole in the bottom through which a string was attached. What happens when I do that? Dmitri asked. She raised an eyebrow. Oh, so you think you'll be the first to reach her? I wouldn't ask any of my men to risk their lives. She shook her head. Your Highness, that's not a great idea. If they lose you and the king passes away, who'll lead the country to victory against the Lorcan? Dmitri leveled a stare at her. You can't change my mind. There aren't enough of us to go around as it is, and I'll do my part in the work of retrieving the princess. The fat lady snorted. Whatever. What happens is this. A shield will form between the diamonds, preventing Lucia's fire pulses from going too far. This will give you enough time to get past. You'll have to hurry, though, since I don't know how long the diamonds will hold their strength. She went into the house, then returned a moment later, carrying metal stakes which she gave to Dmitri. Using the strings on the diamonds, attach them to these. That'll make it easier to see where you've put each diamond, so you don't place them closer than 10 feet. Kelson took a deep breath. And you're positive this will work? She raised her eyebrow and stared at him for several seconds. Never mind, he mumbled. I'm sure it will. Motioning for the men to follow, the fat lady strode around the corner of her cabin. After hiking through the forest and up the hills behind her place, the fat lady stopped near an embankment covered with undergrowth. She pulled aside vines in the side of it, revealing a large stone slab laid into the steep hill. Dmitri, push this over. He did so, revealing the entrance to a tunnel, and gasped in surprise. The tunnel to your cabin? I'd forgotten all about this. I haven't used it in years. Arian took me through it once right when I got here, and a couple of days later I had to use it on my own. If I remember right, it's a bit creepy. The fat lady chuckled. Yes, well, as you know, this'll take you to the castle. Leave it cracked open slightly, so your Minya can communicate with the king and queen while you're gone. The group left the fat lady, feeling much better about their situation. Dmitri supposed it was because they were somewhat more prepared for the next element. He urged his horse to go faster, wishing they hadn't wasted so much precious time in that trap. Would Arian and the baby be all right? She'd be so heartbroken if she lost another child. Kelson matched his horse's pace to Dmitri's. What do we do if the fat lady's solution doesn't work? Go the long way around. Is there one? I think so, through Makaria anyway. But that'll take several days. Time we can't lose. Dmitri rubbed his face. I know. They set up camp on the other side of Ridgewood, a small town a couple of miles from the fat lady's cabin. The group was fairly quiet, and Dmitri couldn't blame them. Even though he felt better about the upcoming element, he worried about other possible traps set by the Lorcan. They'd been very creative so far. Dmitri sighed in exasperation, tired of his thoughts. He needed a distraction. He quickly found his best friend, hoping for some music. Kelson, would you please pull out your instrument? We need something to lighten the mood. Kelson grinned in response and jogged to his horse to grab his guitar. Once the tents had all been set up and the fire had died down, he and Dmitri pulled logs close to the fire, and Kelson started playing songs Dmitri hadn't heard since leaving Truzenor. Dmitri smiled, leaning against a tree trunk, and closed his eyes, enjoying the sound of Kelson's voice and guitar blending together. Later, as he was drifting to sleep, he felt Arian's presence near him. It was as if she'd put her hand on his cheek, then whispered to him that things would be all right. He held on to that for as long as he could. The next morning it stayed with him, giving him courage to continue. Around mid-afternoon, they rounded a large boulder in the trail, and Dmitri's horse reared, nearly trampling someone lying in the middle of the path. Dmitri calmed the horse down, then dismounted, Kelson at his side. It was a woman, and she was dead. What's more, she was obviously one of Arian's handmaids. She wore the white dress with embroidered pink and blue flowers that Arian had all her ladies wear. Dmitri and Kelson met eyes, then ran the rest of the way around the boulder. What if the women had all been killed? The men stopped short at the scene in front of them. Women stood at least 15 to the left, and the man in the center lay on the ground near the trail. They were alive. Some barely. It appeared that all the missing women would now be accounted for. Kelson and Dmitri quickly searched through the group. Kelson called out in joy when he found his wife, but Dmitri's heart plunged. Arian wasn't there. The rest of the men caught up, and several of them cried with excitement when they found their loved ones. Two begged Dmitri to allow them to take their ladies home, to receive the care and attention they so badly needed. Dmitri gave his permission for them to leave. The women were incredibly malnourished and bruised. What had the Lorcan done to them? Dmitri joined Kelson at the side of his wife, Midian. His heart fell, looking down at her. Kelson, I'm afraid she might not make it. Kelson shook his head. She has to! She has to! Tears poured down his face. Dmitri's heart clenched inside his chest, and he spun around, searching for a woman who was well enough to speak with him. He found one, a plump, elderly lady he recognized. He jumped to her side. What happened? The horrible monsters. They attacked us and hurt us. Arian? Is Arian all right? Oh, yes, Highness, they treated her with special care. Dmitri slumped in relief, but found his curiosity piqued. Why? Why did they abuse the rest of you? She only shook her head in response, turning her attention back to a younger woman lying across her lap. Dmitri returned to his friend's side. How is she? Not responding to anything I do. I don't think she knows I'm here. Then Midian moaned, and Kelson's eyes lit up. He put his hands on her shoulders. Midian, are you all right? Kelson, I'm right here. But Midian didn't react. She continued moaning, repeating his name. Then her body went limp. She's not gone, is she? Dmitri asked. She's unconscious. Kelson looked up at Dmitri. I've got to find her help, and faster than my Viral City. Dmitri nodded. Where else, then? Makaria. We're not far away, and I have friends there who'll know what to do. They should be able to care for the others as well. All right, let's get going. The 9 remaining men helped the injured into saddles, some women riding 2 at a time. others able to ride alone. The going was slow, and Dmitri bit his tongue, not wanting to further injure the spirits of the women. But he made a silent promise to Arian that he'd get to her as fast as he could after her handmaidens had been taken care of. An hour later, they weren't far from town when Dmitri heard several very tiny voices arguing. Wanting to hear what the argument was about, he walked closer to the forest where the voices were originating, being careful not to lead his horse and her precious cargo off the trail. After several moments, though, he gave up. He couldn't decipher what was being said. Dmitri looked back at the others, squinting in the sunlight until he spotted Kenji. He motioned for the mechaload to catch up. "Are those Minya voices?" he asked when Kenji reached him, matching his pace. "Sure sounds like it. I've never heard Minyas argue before. Does this bode ill for us?" Kenji chuckled. "Not at all. Minyas fight regularly. Ignore it, Your Highness." Dmitri nodded. "All right." But then, just as he tried to put the argument from his mind, a Minya was hurled through the air, smacking him on the left side of the face. "What in the—" He rubbed his cheek, looking for the creature who had hit him. A small female clutched Dmitri's collar, scowling at the forest. "All right," Dmitri said, trying to shoo the Minya away. "That's enough. Get going." The Minya released his shirt, flitting in the air in front of Dmitri, and glared, crossing her arms. "I'm not returning to them ever again." She turned and shook her fist at the forest. Dmitri hid a laugh. "All right, what do you plan to do?" "I don't care. They don't want me anymore. I'll stay with you." "What's your name?" "Ali." "Well, we could probably use another Minya, if that's what you want." Dmitri crossed his fingers. He might not have to deal with Ariane's Minya anymore. "Fine, but I don't want to be with you." Early looked around. Her face lit up, and she flitted away. Dmitri turned to see where the Minya had gone and rolled his eyes. The little creature had chosen Kenji. Of course. Dmitri brushed off his cloak in irritation. He couldn't figure out why Minyas hated him so much. It didn't make sense. He'd never done anything to get them to dislike him. "You may keep her," Dmitri said to Kenji. "Give me occasional reports on how willing she is to help." Kenji nodded, then turned his attention to Early. The group took a lunch break, and Kelson and Dmitri sat apart from the rest as usual. "I don't know, Dmitri. Honestly, I'm trying not to think of it too much." Dmitri rubbed the back of his head, then realized that by doing so he was showing Kelson he was stressed, which he didn't want to do. This had to be Kelson's decision, and he had to feel unpressured to make it. "Whatever you decide is," he almost said, "the right choice," but stopped himself in time. That would put unnecessary pressure on his best friend. "You'll be guided in your decision, and I'm sure of that." "Thank you," Kelson said. He sighed and leaned back, voicing his thoughts. "My loyalties are with you, as you know, but they're also with Midian. I want to make sure she's taken care of, and I know her the best, so it makes sense that I'd stay with her. But I've committed myself to helping you find Ariane, and I don't feel good about giving up on that either." He stretched out his legs. "Is it possible there isn't a right answer?" "Yes, of course," Kelson nodded slowly. "But the fact is, one thing will always be slightly better than another." "I don't agree with that," Dmitri said. "Whether I eat an apple or a pear matters not. They're both a fruit and taste sweet." "That's hardly a comparison. I'm just trying to make this an easier choice for you. I don't want you to feel like I'm pushing you to go either way. Just know that I'll be grateful to you if you choose to help, but will fully support you if you stay with Midian, who is tied stronger to you than you are to me. Your loyalties should be with your wife." Kelson took a deep breath, releasing it slowly. He nodded. "I'll think it over, and will make my decision when we get to Makaria." They finally reached the small town. Dmitri stared at it from the trail. He had never gotten over just how white and pristine it was. Even though most of the buildings were crumbling, including the castle, it had never lost its regality. It was a beautiful city. The people always said it had been bleached white by the sun. Even the dirt of the streets was pure white. But Dmitri wasn't sure how accurate that was. History tended to be changed over the years as people forgot the truth. He jumped from his horse and joined his friend, who had been carrying Midin and now watched over her. "How is she?" "Not good," Kelson said. He held his wife's hand, but it was apparent she wasn't comfortable with the arrangement. "She doesn't even know who I am." Dmitri glanced at his best friend. He heard the tone in Kelson's voice, even though his face didn't show it. This was deeply discouraging, and Dmitri could understand why. "Are you staying with her then?" Kelson shook his head. "Kenji said she might heal faster if I'm not around. Right now it's just upsetting her to see me not knowing why I'm touching her." He looked up at Dmitri. "I'll trust her to Kenji's friend's care and will continue with you. You realize you may never see her again?" "Yes." The tone behind the short answer conveyed more than the word did, and Dmitri didn't press. He could feel Kelson's frustration, discouragement, and even sense of letting go. He put his hand on Kelson's shoulder and thanked him, then turned to give last-minute instructions to the rest regarding the welfare of the other women. Dmitri chose to stay behind and watch camp while the others took the women into town. If he were to go, the people would stop them frequently. And while he didn't mind helping and giving encouragement, this side trip into Makaria needed to be as fast as possible so they could continue following Arian's trail. The men returned an hour later. Kelson immediately sought out Dmitri, a smile of relief on his face, and Dmitri's spirits lifted as he heard Kelson's report. "She's in good hands, and I wouldn't be surprised if she makes a complete recovery before we return." Dmitri closed his eyes in relief. "Excellent." They followed the trail for only another hour before setting up camp. Kelson whistled as he took care of the horses, brushing them down and giving them carrots. While Dmitri was grateful for his friend's cheerful countenance, he was still puzzled at the man's insistence on caring for the animals. Dmitri shook his head. He couldn't count all the times he told Kelson there was no need for him to be a stable boy any longer, but this was what Kelson enjoyed most, and there wasn't a point in taking it away from him. Right before he turned in, Dmitri received a message from Aldo's Minya, a shriveled old creature. "Aldo says he's been wanting to tell you, Dmitri, that he recovered the magical key of Kilenya and has been using it to scout out the area around Arian and the Lorkon. A wonderful, tell him thank you for what he's doing. The key of Kilenya. He hadn't heard mention of that in ages." The Minya disappeared with a flash and returned quickly with another message. "It says he loves Arian and will do anything to get her back. Then he said not to attempt to contact him for a while, to wait for him to message you again. He's in a very difficult situation, and one mistake on his part could mean his death or the death of Arian and your unborn child." "How is Arian?" Dmitri asked. The Minya disappeared and reappeared. "She's in good health. Aldo isn't sure why, but they've been very careful with her. Tender, even." Dmitri sank to his cot, head in hands. He took a deep breath, then looked up at the floating creature. "What would Aldo have me do now?" "Continue onward. He'll get in touch with you when he's able. If he doesn't contact you before you get there, set up camp a day's journey from August Fortress, the Shengol stronghold. That's where she's being held." "I can do that. Again, give him my thanks." The Minya nodded, then disappeared with a flash. Kelson sat on his cot. "Perhaps we should deliver a report to the King and Queen. We haven't since yesterday afternoon." "Good idea. Where is Arian's Minya?" "I'll call her." Kelson stepped outside of the tent, then returned minutes later with the Minya. Dmitri sat up and addressed her. "Deliver a message to the castle. Tell the King and Queen that Arian is safe, we're an hour outside of Makaria, and have gone through 2 of the elements." The Minya mock saluted Dmitri, stuck her tongue out and flitted away. He suppressed the urge to grab her as she passed. "That Minya needs a good throttling," he said. Kelson only chuckled in response. They didn't have to wait long for her return, which surprised Dmitri. What surprised him even more was how she acted. The Minya flitted back and forth between Kelson and Dmitri, howling and wailing. "Stop it!" Dmitri tried to grab her, but she zipped out of arm's length. "What's wrong?" he asked. The castle has been attacked again. What? Dmitri and Kelson said at the same time. When? Dmitri asked. This afternoon, possibly morning. She flitted to the tent wall and pounded her tiny fists on the fabric, howling even louder. The two friends met eyes. We're not going to get any information out of her like this, Kelson said. He approached her and tried to talk to her. A sickening feeling hit Dmitri's stomach as he realized why she was so upset. Something had happened to Eliane's parents. He rushed to her, ignoring the cautious approach. What of the king and queen? Dmitri asked, then repeated his question in a yell. Are they all right? Are they in danger? The king is. The Minya burst into tears. He's dead. Dead? Dmitri asked. Impossible. It couldn't be. King Roylance? No. The minion nodded. And the queen is very sick. Very, very sick. Dmitri whirled to Kelson, whose face had blanched. How? No one passed us. There's no way the Lorcon got back to Maveril without us noticing. Kelson nodded. We'd have seen or heard something. Arian's Minya continued her message, bawling between sentences. I talked to the queen. She doesn't think she'll live much longer. She was injured. The Lorcon tried to kill her too, but were unsuccessful. She said the crown has passed on to you, Dmitri, that you are now in charge of the kingdom. She will be gone soon. Dmitri sank to his knees in the tent, his heart and lungs clenching, refusing to operate. A stabbing pain hit him in the stomach, then spread across his body. King Roylance was dead. He'd been a father to Dmitri, kind, gentle, patient. He'd believed in Dmitri, had trusted him, had taught him to be a prince where his own father had failed. And the queen, dear, sweet Queen Aralise, patient as a husband, loving, tender. She'd seen his potential long before he'd become a better man. How would he survive without them? Then the thought hit him. Arian. Did she know already? Would the Lorcan torture her with the information? Oh, if only she were with him. He'd hold her, wipe the tears from her cheeks, comfort her and be comforted in return. Dmitri slipped into the blankets on his cot, barely recognizing that the Minya had left and Kelson had returned to his own bed. Aching, physical pain was the only thing he felt. Dmitri hadn't slept well since he and the others left to find the women, but the night after finding out about the king and queen was the worst yet. He relived the experience of learning about King Roylance's death over and over again, and when he finally had drifted off to sleep, his dreams were emotionally charged and disturbing. The next morning he did his best to put them from his mind as he packed up his things and saddled his horse. Right as they were leaving camp, an unfamiliar Minya approached Dmitri, delivering a message from Brodyan, the leader of the Makalo army, informing him that the Makalos had gathered an army in the valley just east of Gevkin. They were awaiting word to start the attack. Brodyan fully expected a war to break out, and they wanted to be ready for it. Kelson, as usual, rode next to Dmitri. He waited until the Minya had left, then glanced at his friend. Hopefully, it won't come to that. I know, but I don't plan to run this kingdom on hopes. Dmitri fell silent for a moment. He put aside the thought that he was in fact leading the kingdom now. What we need is to appoint a general. Who would be best suited to leading an army? I'm not sure, but we could start with asking Brend. Dmitri nodded. He turned in his saddle and called for Brend to come forward. When the man arrived, Dmitri asked, "You are on the king's guard, correct?" "Yes, your majesty." Dmitri didn't hesitate at the formal majesty compared to the highness of before. News of the king's death had quickly reached the men, and all had started treating Dmitri differently, more respectfully, less like a prince and more like a king. For how long? Just 2 years. Dmitri shook his head. Not long enough. Who has been in the guard the longest and is loyal, knowledgeable and hard-working? Probably Lars. He's over 50 years of age, but the king trusted him with everything, and he's still in excellent physical condition. The men respect him, and he's a natural leader. Kelson made a sound of agreement. I've heard a lot about him. If he'd been home when we left, He would have been right here with us. Thank you, Dmitri said, excusing Brend. He had Kelson seek out Arian's Minya, asking her to inform Lars that he had been promoted to general and was to round up an army, gathering any and all who were willing to fight for the cause of freedom. The Minya disappeared with a flash, then returned. He wasn't there, but I'll probably let you know when I find him. We'll see how long that takes, Dmitri said to Kelson when the Minya had left. But Kelson was distracted by something. He pointed at the charred remains of a bush they were just passing. Look at that! They started passing many other burned things, evidence that they were approaching Lassia, the third element. Dmitri pulled out his journal. I'll make note of this, then we should backtrack to where it's safe to discuss the situation. After scribbling a quick message, he pulled his horse around and called for everyone to follow him to a section near the forest that hadn't been burned. When the rest had gathered, he said, Men, take care. We're approaching the next element. From the looks of the land, this area will be safe, but we can't be sure about that. Kelson and I are going forward. I want the rest of you to wait here until I give the go-ahead to proceed. He made sure they understood, then dismounted, handing the reins to Kenji. Kelson entrusted his horse to Brend. Then the two friends started down the path on foot. Kelson rubbed the back of his neck. I'm sure the fat lady knows what she's talking about, but something as dangerous as a fire pulsar makes me nervous. Dmitri nodded, slinging his bag over his shoulder. I know, I've thought over it quite a bit. And you're sure you should do it? Dmitri raised his eyebrow. Of course. Kelson shook his head. This isn't like the last two elements. We know what's coming, yes, but it's very dangerous. Dmitri, think about it. The king has passed away. You're the only thing these people have now, and if you don't make me understand your concerns, let's hurry. Kelson smiled. Yeah, I should have guessed trying to talk you out of it wouldn't work. If I'd been afraid to get hurt or die, I would have sent someone else to bring Arian back. Up ahead, the trail entered a small canyon made of huge rocks and boulders that had fallen from the mountains. It looked like fire had flared through the canyon and down the trail, burning things along the way. Dmitri fingered the diamonds in his pocket, counting them over and over as they neared the canyon entrance. Just then, Early flitted past Dmitri's head. Kenji sent me. What should I do? There's a fire pulsar up here, Kelson said. Let us know when she's going to send the next blast of flames. Early gave 2 thumbs up, then paused, concentrating. She hasn't caught wind of you yet, I don't think. She zipped ahead, calling over her shoulder, I'll let you know when she does. Dmitri and Kelson proceeded forward cautiously. Do we know how hot the fire burns? Kelson asked, in a whisper. Dmitri shook his head. If they were hit by flames, they'd be scorched either way. The two friends waited just outside the very narrow canyon in a section that hadn't been touched by flames. Early rushed back. Fire coming, take cover. Dmitri stepped farther away from the mouth just to be sure, and Kelson followed. The element blasted past them seconds later. Dmitri took several more steps back, holding his hands over his face to protect it. That was hot. Once it stopped, the two friends continued forward, cautiously watching for signs of more blazes. Don't touch the rock, Dmitri said. Kelson nodded. Too hot. Not wanting to be stuck in the canyon when the next burst came, they rushed through the winding rocks, being careful not to brush up against the walls on either side. Before they'd reached the end, Early appeared next to Dmitri. Run, sire, run! The next blast is about to happen. Dmitri frantically looked left and right, nowhere to hide. Early was correct. They had to run if they wanted to make it. Without regard for whether Lassia would see them or not, the two men raced forward and through the other side of the short canyon. They jumped behind a large boulder just as the flames blasted past them, licking the edges of the rock. They stared at each other, shaking their heads. That had been way too close. We need a plan, Dmitri yelled to Kelson over the roar. He had Early point out Lassia's direction. Let's not run directly toward her. Instead, we're going to head to the next shelter. We can zigzag our way like that until we're close enough to place the diamonds. Kelson nodded. Has she seen us? Early shook her head. I think she can sense you coming, but she hasn't spotted you yet. She pointed. The next rock is that way. The flames ended. Run, Early called. Dmitri and Kelson shot out from behind the boulder and dashed for the rock Early indicated. Just then, Dmitri saw Lassia at the same time she looked at him. They met eyes, and he nearly stumbled. Her eyes were the color of fire, and she was well over 6 feet tall. Her hair was red and curly, burning on the ends. It was a flaming mass around her head. Her anger seethed, practically like the flames she pulsed, and even though the land around him was exceptionally hot, Dmitri got the chills. He jumped behind the rock and looked at Kelson, who had also seen Lassia. What caused such hatred in a creature? Finally, after zigzagging for several moments, they were close enough to start placing the diamonds. Dmitri sneaked a glance around the rock before the next onslaught and saw with relief that she'd been chained in place. But why was the metal holding? Shouldn't she have been able to melt through it? Did you see how angry she was? Kelson said. It's like she wants to rip me apart, burn through my flesh and feed me to moles. Yes, I felt it. The next burst of flame was longer than the previous, and Dmitri wondered if being closer gave her more energy. He didn't have time to speculate, though. He fished in his bag and pulled out the stakes, handing them to Kelson, then dug in his pocket, grabbing the diamonds. He and Kelson quickly tied each diamond to a stake. The next burst of flame came and went while they did so, and when they were finished, Dmitri took 3 of the stakes, leaving 2 in Kelson's hands. I've been counting, Kelson said. She takes 60 seconds to recharge for her next blast. That only gives us a minute to put them in place. Yes, we'll have to be very precise, not only in our timing but our placement of the diamonds. The fat lady said 10 feet apart, with nothing obstructing their view of each other. This means we'll have to get close to Lassia. Dmitri nodded. Even with the diamonds being 10 feet apart, Lassia was huge, and her hair and yellow robes billowed around her, filling the space the diamonds would need. Dmitri took a breath. He was sure it wouldn't feel pleasant to touch even just her clothing. You go that way, he said to Kelson, pointing to the left. I'll go to the right. They waited for the next blast. It was much, much hotter, and Dmitri felt like he'd been thrown into an oven. Searing heat rushed across his entire body. He dropped the metal spikes, too hot to hold, and groaned in pain, watching as blisters formed on his arms and hands. Kelson called out in agony, and Dmitri turned to his best friend. The expression on Kelson's face showed he was doing his best to hide the pain, but oozing blisters had popped up all over his face and neck, making it appear like he'd been afflicted with a horrible disease. Dmitri was sure he looked the same. It seemed like several minutes passed before the flames died. A rush of cool wind followed, and doing his best to ignore the burn, Dmitri grabbed the spikes. Go, he called to Kelson. They dashed out from behind the rock, parting ways. After 4 running leaps, Dmitri guessed he'd gone at least 10 feet, fell to his knees and plunged the first stake into the ground, making sure the diamond wasn't blocked by any debris. He rolled to the right, around a rock, then jumped up and ran to the next location, piercing the second stake through the dirt. Next blast coming, Early hollered at him, waving her hands frantically. Next blast! Hurry! Dmitri dashed the last couple of feet to the final place and shoved the stick into the ground. Then he raced to the nearest boulder, hoping it would be large enough. The blast came, violent, red with fury, and Dmitri rolled into a ball, trying to protect his head. But then the fire stopped. Dmitri released his hold and waited a moment, then peered around the rock. Lassia was staring at the diamond nearest her, an expression of shock on her face. White light flashed from diamond to diamond, connecting them, and Dmitri had to turn away from the brightness. He peeked again and watched as a solid glowing sphere formed around Lassia, connecting the diamonds, coming to a rounded top above her. The sphere was milky and glittered multiple colors in the sun, the surface shiny like water. It glowed brighter and brighter until he had to look away again. The light dimmed, and when he was sure it was safe, Dmitri got to his feet cautiously coming around the boulder. He waved to Kilson, who had taken shelter behind a rock nearby. Kilson laughed, and Dmitri could see why. Lassia pounded on the inside of a perfect diamond ball, apparently screaming, but no sound came through. "Things didn't go exactly how the fat lady thought they would," Dmitri said, joining Kilson. Kilson laughed. "Nope. And look who's mad now." Lassia glared at them, and Dmitri recoiled, amazed at how inhuman she looked. The expression on her face was more intense than any he'd ever seen before. Complete hatred, seething rage. It distorted her features, which might have been attractive otherwise. Red veins popped out all over her face, neck, and arms. Wings Dmitri hadn't noticed earlier unfolded, beating against the sphere that contained her. Her bright red eyes flamed at the two friends. Early flitted up alongside them. "She's about to pulse again," she said. "You might want to move." Dmitri looked at her. "You can tell, even through the diamond." "No, but I know that look on her face." "Right." The two men backed up, but Dmitri felt no fear. Nothing was coming through that surface. Then Lassia tensed her muscles, the veins on her face almost appearing to burst, and red and blue fire exploded from every pore of her body. It looked incredibly painful, but she obviously didn't mind. For a moment she wasn't visible because of all the flames. The diamond ball started glowing brightly, and Dmitri couldn't watch for a moment. Kilson grabbed Dmitri's arm, yanking him away. "The dirt!" Dmitri jumped back when he saw that the sphere was melting the ground around it. The hot sections spread, liquefying the place where Dmitri and Kilson had just been standing. They moved even farther away. "Dmitri..." The diamond ball sank a foot into the dirt. The flame from Lassia dissipated, and she was again visible inside, angrier than earlier, if that was possible. "Did you see that?" Dmitri asked. "The thing went into the ground." Kilson nodded. "It melted the stuff around it. I can only imagine how hot it has to be to do that." He turned to Dmitri. "What now?" "We go back and get the others, I suppose. I think she's being contained enough for us to safely pass." Kilson chuckled, motioning to her. "You're definitely right, and I think she knows it." Dmitri glanced at Lassia. She mouthed soundlessly at him, shaking a fist. He snorted, then yelled at her. "Not so tough now, are you?" "You might not want to provoke her," Kilson said. "Who knows how long she'll remember this moment?" "Oh, it's fine." Dmitri made a few childish faces at the fire pulsar before turning back to Kilson. "You look terrible." Kilson reached up to touch his face but dropped his hand. "I hurt. Everywhere." "Let's go back and see if Kenji has an ointment for us." A stinging on his arm where Kilson had grabbed him earlier reminded him of his own blisters, and he looked down. Several had popped and were oozing a clear liquid. "I haven't been burned this badly in years," Kilson said. Just then, Early gave the warning that Lassia was sending another burst of flame. They turned to watch. The same thing as before happened. She looked like she was in a lot of pain. Right before fire burst out of her, the ground melted again, but this time her diamond prison started to sink quickly. Deeper and deeper it went, as the fire exploding from Lassia's skin continued heating the ball. Finally it stopped. "Wow," Kilson said. "Wow is right." Dmitri stepped forward, cautiously testing the ground that had melted. His foot sank and he pulled back. "I think not walking on this dirt would be a good idea." He turned from the diamond ball. "Let's get the others." They stepped away from Lassia and went through the canyon, joining the rest of the group several minutes later. The men cheered when they saw the two friends. Dmitri went straight to Kenji. "You know how to heal burns, I hope." "Well, yes," Kenji said, staring at the blisters covering Dmitri. "But, unfortunately, I don't have access to the ways we used to use as Mokolos." "Which are?" "Kaede trees, of course. I know there are some that dot this trail, but they're likely to be hybrids and not pure." He came to Dmitri, inspecting the burst blisters. "The best thing we can do is cleanse and anoint these with cream. then have you loosely cover them to protect yourself from infection and further damage." Dmitri nodded, and Kenji got to work right away, enlisting the help of 2 other Makolos. They carefully cleansed Dmitri and Kelson's faces, necks, arms and hands, then put a layer of brownish cream all over the burned skin. Dmitri could barely see past the stuff on his face. He wrapped a shawl around his head, ignoring the expressions of the men, several of whom looked to be almost laughing, and mounted his horse, motioning for the rest to follow. He led them through the narrow canyon, wishing he had something more to protect his skin from the hot sun. When they neared Lassia, he jumped down, proceeding forward on foot. The ground had hardened enough to walk on, and they got up close to the diamond sphere. Only the top few feet were visible. Lassia jumped when Dmitri looked down at her, then started screaming and banging the sides of the ball again. The veins on her face glowed bright red, and then a burst of flame erupted from her paws, making the ball glow intensely. "Can you feel that?" Kenji asked, over the murmurs of surprise from the others. Dmitri turned to him. "Feel what?" "Her anger. This valley will be cursed because of her." "No, I can't, but let's hurry and cover her up, so no one knows she's here. Heaven help the people who discover her when that happens." "How long will she survive without food and water?" Kelson asked. "I don't know," Dmitri said. "I'm not familiar with fire pulsars and their needs or habits, but it wouldn't surprise me if she sticks around for a very long time." The sun was getting low in the sky when Lassia was finally covered, a small hill marking where her diamond ball rested. "May this valley grow beautifully and cover the effect she'll have on it," Kenji said, a sad expression on his face. "But all the flowers in the world won't mask her angry emotions." Dmitri nodded. He gave Kenji a moment to himself, turning to the others. "We haven't gone very far today. We'll continue until Kenji can no longer feel Lassia's evil influence." The 3 scurried away to the dais. They went onward for another hour, stopping well after Kenji noted they'd passed out of the reach of the fire pulsar's emotions. The men set up camp in a grove of trees. Minya approached Dmitri during dinner, informing him that Lars and his army were stationed in a valley eastward. Dmitri couldn't help but wonder what had happened to Arian's Minya. She probably searched far and wide, trying to find someone else to do her job. "That was really fast," Kelson said. "Yes, it was," Dmitri addressed the Minya. "Send my compliments to Lars." "How did he gather the army so quickly?" The Minya disappeared, then reappeared. "He said that King Roydens had instructed him to do so before he passed away. Also, Lars and Brozhan have joined and are ready to attack when you give word." Dmitri thanked the Minya and dismissed him, then turned back to his food. He smiled to himself, proud he'd picked the same man the king had chosen. But thinking of King Roylance made tears come to Dmitri's eyes. He was a great man, blessing the lives of those around him even after death. Dmitri shook his head. He still couldn't believe his father-in-law was gone. A renewed determination to reach Arian as soon as possible flooded through his system as he finished dinner. When he'd cleaned his plate, he jumped up, needing to pace to work through his emotions. He refused to think more of King Roylance. He couldn't afford to have a breakdown right then. Instead, he centered his thoughts on Arian and how it would feel to have her back, protected in his arms. Later, as they were settling in for the night, taking care not to further damage their healing skin, Kilson said, "Dmitri, one more element. Just one." "Yes, Earth. I wonder what it'll be." Dmitri didn't answer. He couldn't even fathom what the Lorcon would come up with for the next trap. The last 3 had been clever. The next morning was cloudy and cold. Dmitri pulled his cloak closer with one hand while he finished strapping his saddle on his horse with the other. The cold felt good on his blisters, but he didn't want to risk getting ill. He smiled to himself, remembering the time Kelson had taught him how to put on a saddle. He'd been torn, wanting to learn in case he was ever alone with his horse and didn't have someone to depend on, but recognizing how inappropriate it was for a prince to do such a task. It had taken them several tries before Amaryllis had allowed him to get close enough. She seemed to sense his hesitation and inexperience. Once she'd stepped on his foot for the third time, however, he'd taken charge. She relaxed, he relaxed, and it had been easy ever since. This part of the trail was boring. Rain poured from the skies, only letting up for a couple of brief moments. But after a while, the group finally reached something interesting to look at. Boiling, shifting, dark brown mud covered every inch of the ground, from the mountain on the left to a sharp drop-off on the right. "This must be the last element," Kilson said. Dmitri inclined his head, then instructed everyone to take a break, even though they'd only been on the trail for 20 minutes. "There's probably something wrong with it," he said to Kilson. "Only one way to find out." Kilson jumped off his horse. "Don't touch it," Dmitri called, also dismounting. Kilson stopped and looked back. "I'll be fine." He grabbed a stick and poked it in the mud as Dmitri joined him. Nothing happened. Kilson shrugged, dropped the stick, then put his finger in the substance. The section of earth around him boiled harder. He screamed and jerked back. "It's burning me!" Dmitri tried to grab Kilson to get a closer look at his finger, but Kilson wouldn't let him. "Get it off!" he shrieked. Kenji rushed forward. "I've got the cleansing solution I used on your blisters yesterday." Kilson nodded with relief. "Try it, please." He held out his finger, cringing as Kenji raised the flask. The green liquid poured over Kelson's finger, and Kenji looked at Kilson hopefully. "No good, no good," he gasped, cradling his hand. "Burning still." But then he started screaming. "Kenji, there has to be something else. Anything," Dmitri said, nearly panicked. "I can't watch him suffer like this." Kenji pointed back to where they'd camped. "The trees where we stayed looked like they might be related to Kaida trees." He rushed on. "But the chances—" Dmitri grabbed the Makola's shoulders. "Is there a possibility at all, even remotely?" Kenji nodded. "Yes, but if so, we'll need a great amount of sap. I do what you need to do." Kenji turned to the group and started calling out orders. Soon someone had helped Kilson onto his horse, and everyone was rushing back to the grove where they'd stayed. Kenji showed two men how to gather the sap by cutting a ridge along the side of the tree and putting a rounded piece of bark at the end, holding it downward so as to allow the sap to drip into a helmet. At the same time, another set of men ground dried bark and leaves from the same tree into powder. After an agonizing hour, they had enough powder and sap mixed together, forming a thin paste, which Kenji then prepared to apply to Kelson's finger. Kelson had slipped into unconsciousness from pain during the ride back. Kenji stepped to Kelson, then looked around. "I forgot. I need clean cloth. The injury has to be wrapped to finish healing." Someone brought forward a clean sock. Kenji quickly covered the finger with the paste, then wrapped the sock tightly around it. Kelson didn't respond. "We'll sleep for a while, it's part of the healing process," he told them. "I'm surprised at how painful the mud was," Dmitri said. "It was just the tip of his finger. Imagine if it had been his entire body. He wouldn't have survived." "Well, we can't continue forward until we find a way through." Kenji nodded and wrapped his coat tighter around himself. "I've been thinking about that. Kaide sap purifies and heals. If we could gather enough, we might be able to cleanse the mud, allowing us to move through it. How much would we need?" "Garlands. Basically everything these trees have to offer. If only we had pure Kaida sap, it would be simpler." Dmitri grimaced, looking up at the trees, mentally apologizing to them. "All right, get the men working." Kenji nodded, then organized the group into teams of two. One person to gather the sap, the other to grind the bark and leaf mixture. 3 hours later, Kelson woke up and joined Dmitri. "How do you feel?" Dmitri asked. "Aside from the blisters, really good." Kelson showed his finger. "Nearly perfect again." Dmitri stared at the hand in awe. "That's incredible." "I know, I can't believe it. It's like nothing happened. And what a relief. It's impossible to describe how painful that was." Neither said anything for a moment. Dmitri raised his hand to rub the back of his neck in frustration, but remembering his blisters, dropped it. These Lorcon traps were very effective, and getting Aryan was taking way too long. Kenji approached. "I have a better idea." Dmitri turned to the Makalor. What's that? Instead of using the sap to work on the mud directly, we're going to cover our bodies and our horses' bodies with it. That way, we'll make our way through without delay, purifying as we go. It'll take much less time because when we get to the other side of the mud, we'll have cleansed everything already. Hopefully. Dmitri nodded, a smile growing across his face. Sounds great. Kenji reached for Kelson's hand. Let me see your finger. Kelson held it up and Kenji inspected it. Good as new, healed and purified. He smiled broadly. I'll tell the men the results and the new plan. It should give them energy to continue. Several hours later, nearly all the trees had been worked on. Only a few remained. Dmitri shook his head, watching. It's sad that so many trees will be destroyed just to make it possible for us to cross a very small section of Earth. I have a feeling they'd give up their lives willingly to undo the poisonous effects of the Lorcan. Dmitri turned to Kelson, putting his hand on his friend's shoulder. You're right. Let's go help. The sun was 2 hours away from setting when everyone finished. It took 40 minutes more to mix the sap and bark and spread it all over themselves and their horses. Once this was done, Dmitri gave the signal to mount, and they headed back to the poisoned mud. Kelson volunteered to test the mud again. Dmitri protested at first, but then decided to allow Kelson the, honor, for lack of a better word. The man must be suicidal. But nothing happened to Kelson when he touched the surface, and what's more, a film on top of the mud rushed away from the sap, similar to how oil tries to get away from soap. The mud had been purified, as Kenji predicted. The men cheered and lined up behind Dmitri and Kelson. The horses were skittish at first, and it took a strong, unrelenting hand to keep them moving forward. Dmitri watched with interest as the mud parted from his horse's hooves, causing a small wall on either side of him to form. It didn't stay back. Parts of it collapsed several times, trying to reconnect between the horses. But it didn't burn the animals, and he could see the film racing away. After a few minutes, everyone was in the boiling earth, and Dmitri had to put all his attention on pressing forward. His horse really struggled with how deep the mud was, and how high the wall went when she pushed into it. The film roiled back from them, with occasional splashes of wet dirt hitting them. Dmitri was grateful Kenji had asked everyone to cover themselves all over, otherwise those splashes would have proven deadly. For 15 minutes during the trek, they walked into mud at least 40 feet deep. The sunlight disappeared, whether from sunset or the high walls, Dmitri wasn't sure, but he had to slow down, allowing the others to keep up with him. Several times, he worried he'd lead them over the edge of the cliff if he wasn't careful. Eerie shapes formed in the surfaces around him, and he patted his horse's neck, comforting her. Then it was all over and they pulled up at the other end, nearly as clean as they'd been when they first entered the sticky substance. They didn't get far before everyone dismounted and collapsed on the ground in exhaustion. Not only had gathering the sap been tedious, but holding on to a skittish horse for over an hour, slowly moving through deep mud, had been very taxing. They set up camp, ate a quick dinner, then went to bed. Dmitri and Kelson were pleased to find that the Kaida sap had healed their blisters overnight. Dmitri sighed in relief. The constant burning would finally stop. The trail took the group down a series of switchbacks and past a small forest. They neared a cabin and hesitated. After sending a scout ahead, Dmitri finally decided it was all right for them to continue onward. They were passing the cabin when the door burst open. Aldo jumped out, nearly causing Dmitri to fall from his horse. But when he saw who it was, he quickly dismounted, running to the older man and hugging him. "Aldo, you're safe." "Wonderful timing. I just got back and saw you out front." Dmitri turned to the men and asked them to set up a temporary camp. He and Kelson joined Aldo in the cabin. "I'm so grateful to see you," Dmitri said. "Any news of Arian? How is she?" "Last I saw, fine. Still pregnant, still being kept with the Shengols, who, by the way, have been held hostage this entire time." "Is that possible?" Kelson asked. "Shengols? Captured?" Aldo shrugged. "Apparently, since it's being done." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. The Lorcon have kept away from Arian, so far. We should be able to key into the surrounding town and get the Shengels out at the same time as we rescue Arian. It'll have to be done in stealth, however, since the Lorcon aren't likely to let us walk in without putting up a fight. Where are they now? In the center of August Township. Are they far enough away not to cause problems when we get to the fortress? Aldo shook his head. I doubt it. We'll need to have a solid plan in place. He rubbed his thinning hair. I suggest a diversion. The Minias could provide that by making it seem like we're heading for the city center. Meanwhile, we'll split the group into two. Half will approach the fortress on foot, and the other half will use the key. Dmitri, I'll need to instruct you on how to use it, since you'll lead that group. I can take charge of the group that sets out on foot. Dmitri put his hand on Aldo's shoulder. Thank you. I really appreciate this. Aldo nodded. We'll leave first thing in the morning. They arose early. Dmitri went from person to person, assigning them all to a specific group. He was nearing the last individual, one of Kenji's friends, when Aldo burst out of the cabin and rushed toward him. Your Majesty, plans have changed. Dmitri whirled and joined the elderly man. What now? Arian's had her baby and is no longer being held with the Shengels. Dmitri felt the blood leave his face. No, what? What do you mean? He'd missed the birth of their child. I scouted things out one more time this morning with the key to verify that our plan would still work. And Arian has had her baby. Dmitri sank to the steps of the cabin. I failed her. I can't believe I missed the most important event of my life with her. But then he jumped to his feet, grabbing Aldo's shoulders. How is she? Is she all right? And the babe? They both appeared to be fine, but this changes our plans drastically. Since she's now being kept with the Lorcon, the Shengels are completely left alone, and what's more, the fortress feels different. Something has changed, though I'm not sure what. I'll get Kilson. We need to figure out what to do now. Alda nodded, and a couple of minutes later they met in the cabin again, Kilson in tow, looking confused. Dmitri quickly explained what had happened. We have to make new plans. He motioned to Aldo, who leaned forward, unrolling a map of August Township. I've been thinking, we won't have to change much. We'll still have two groups heading that way, one with the key, the other on foot. The difference is this. Those of you with the key will go to the town center to get Arian and the baby instead of heading to the fortress. The other group will still rescue the Shengels. Aldo looked up at Dmitri. Who do you want to assist you? Dmitri scratched his chin. It depends. My group will probably need stealth more than numbers, and the others will need forces, and as many as possible. Agreed. All right, I'll take Kelson, Kenji, Early, and you, Aldo. Dmitri thought about it for a minute. That should be enough. Kelson raised his hand. Actually, I've been thinking. You need someone you trust to head up the attack on the stronghold. Why don't you have me do that? Dmitri nodded, seeing the wisdom in Kelson's suggestion. That would be good, and you'll take everyone else with you. Also, Aldo said, motioning to Dmitri, didn't you say there's an army of Makalos and humans waiting for word from you? Yes, they can attack the fortress as well and provide a much-needed diversion. Aldo raised his hand. I have a different idea. What's that? The Lorcan have gathered an army only a couple of hours away from where Lars has gathered yours. Do the Lorcons know we have one as well? Dmitri asked. Aldo shook his head. Not that I can tell. Good. We can have Lars and Brojan attack the Lorcon army right as Kelson is approaching the fortress and you and I are heading to get Arian. Just then, someone pounded on the door to the cabin. Aldo rose to open it, and Brend rushed in. They've rejoined us and brought a few more men. Dmitri stood. Who? Those who left when we found the women. They got here as fast as they could, left their wives with family. They're willing and able to help. Thanks for bringing word, Dmitri said. Express my gratitude and make sure they're well rested. We'll definitely be using them. Brend left, and Dmitri sat down again. We'll have them go with you, Kelson. Kelson nodded. Aldo cleared his throat, sitting down as well. Sire, I don't think I'll go with you to get Arian. Dmitri knitted his eyebrows, watching the older man closely. Any reason why? I mentioned that August Fortress feels different, right? Dmitri inclined his head. I think I need to help those who are heading to it as much as I can, and also to keep my eye on the overall picture. I've found a lookout point opposite the fortress where I'll be safe while watching the progress of Kelson's group. I'll also be able to see the town center, so I will alert you when and if the Lorcon head that way. All right, I see the benefit in doing that. You'll have to show me exactly where Aaron is being held, though. Aldo nodded. Of course. Dmitri got to his feet and started pacing, needing to think out loud. All right. So let's make sure we all know what's happening. Kelson, you and your men will go toward the fortress right away. He looked at Aldo. How long does it take to get there from here? 3 or 4 hours on foot. With the horses an hour, if they go quickly. We'll have you leave at once, Kelson, but stop when you reach the edge of this forest. He pointed to a spot on the map. And wait for further instructions. Kelson acknowledged that he understood, and Dmitri continued. I'll send word to Lars and Brojan to begin the attack as soon as they can. In the meantime, Aldo, will you keep to the city and let us know how the Lorcon respond to news of the impending war? After the armies advance their attack, we'll have Kelson and his men head to the stronghold. While they're doing that, Aldo, again report any activity on the part of the Lorcon and key back immediately. Instruct me on how to use the key, then show me where Arian is, and we'll part ways. Kenji, Early and I will rescue Arian, and Aldo, you'll head to your lookout point. Dmitri blew out a long breath of air and sat down again. Did I miss anything? I don't think so, Aldo said. All right then. Kelson, take your men now. Aldo, keep to the city. I'll send word to Lars and Brojan. Dmitri followed his best friend out the door, then waited until Kelson had rounded up the men and given them their new instructions. Dmitri thanked them all and said a few words of encouragement. He instructed Kelson to take Arian's Minya with them, then sent that group on their way. He and Aldo watched as the men rode into the forest that separated the cabin from August Fortress. Dmitri turned to Aldo, grateful for a moment alone with the elderly gentleman. Kenji was resting in the cabin, wanting to preserve his strength. I owe you a great deal of gratitude, Aldo, for everything you've done. Aldo smiled briefly, then knit his eyebrows. I'd tell you I was just doing my job, but that's not true. Knowing that Arian is in potential danger has been nearly unbearable, and my brother, murdered. A dark expression crossed his face. I'll do anything to pull these Lorcan down and protect those I love. I know what you mean. Sadness filled Dmitri's heart when he thought of Ezra, and that sadness doubled when he remembered his father and mother-in-law. You heard of the king and queen? Aldo's eyes filled with tears. Yes. He shook his head. I've felt so very torn over the past couple of days. I wish I'd been there to say goodbye to Roylands. He was my best friend. But I couldn't leave Ariane where she was, even for a moment. I needed to protect the future that is represented in her. He turned from Dmitri, taking out a handkerchief. An intense feeling of gratitude flooded through Dmitri. This man had proven his loyalty over and over again. What would Dmitri and the rest have done without him? He put his hand on Aldo's shoulder. Again, thank you. Aldo nodded, but didn't say anything for a moment. Then he put his handkerchief away. All right, enough blubbering. We've got work to do. Dmitri watched as Aldo pulled the key of Kilenya out of his pocket. He'd need to learn to use it soon. The man inserted it into the lock on the cabin door, turned it to the left and said, August Township. He pushed the door open, and on the other side was a dusty, deserted street instead of the cabin's interior. The fortress was just visible over the tops of buildings that lined the street. Aldo turned and said goodbye, then shut the door behind him. Dmitri waited a moment before entering the cabin, wanting to be sure the link had closed all the way. He pushed the door open and smiled when he saw the table and chairs. That key was amazing. Kenji lifted his head from where he'd rested it on the table. He gave Dmitri a wave. "Ready?" "Yes," Dmitri said. "Have Early send a message to Broyan and Lars, telling them to start the attack on the Lorkon army as soon as they can, and to rush it." Kenji nodded and jumped up, leaving the cabin. Dmitri gave the place a look over, making sure nothing of his was there, then stepped outside and took his and Kenji's horses around to the back of the cabin, where they'd stay until their owners returned. Then the two men waited. 10 minutes later, Dmitri looked up in shock when Aldo's Minya appeared next to him with a flash. The little Minya looked to be exhausted and was hunched over. He was old, much older than even Aldo, and most likely didn't have a lot longer to live. He barely rasped out the message. "Aldo says 2 of the 3 Lorkon just rushed out of the city and are heading toward the battle. They must have heard it was about to start. Now only the Lorkon leader is in the town center, and he seems to be waiting for something, possibly an attempt to rescue the princess. That wouldn't surprise me." Dmitri nodded his thanks to the elderly Minya and turned to Kenji. "Would you have Early send a message to Kelson to go ahead with the Shengol rescue?" Kenji did so. Then Dmitri and the Mikalo again waited. This time, things took much longer, and Dmitri had to get up to pace. What if it didn't work? What if the Lorkon leader refused to leave the city center? What if he took Iron away again, forcing Dmitri to go even longer without seeing his wife? 30 agonizing minutes later, the door to the cabin popped open and Aldo rushed through. "He's gone! The leader is gone! You must come now!" Where did he go? He spotted Kelson's group, and for some reason, he took off in the other direction. Aldo held the door and the link opened, and Dmitri and Kenji dashed through into a darkened building. The windows had been smashed out and glass lay across the floor. "Where are we?" Dmitri asked. "Down the street from the town center. Don't worry about the glass. This happened days ago. I'm heading to my lookout point. You go get Ariane and the babe." Aldo pointed at a large building on the left, of which only the top was visible. "That's the town center. Unless I'm mistaken, she's in one of the back rooms. There's only one door and one way to that room. You'll have to be incredibly cautious not to get tracked by the Lorkon." Aldo motioned to Early, who was flitting in the air. "May I take your Minya? I'll need to communicate with you and Kilson, and mine is hurting too badly to help right now." Kenji gave Early instructions to go with Aldo, and Dmitri and the older man embraced. They wished each other good luck. Aldo gave Dmitri the key, along with very brief instructions on how to use it, then dashed off down the street, disappearing between buildings. Dmitri was surprised the elderly man could move so quickly. He pocketed the key, turning back to Kenji. "This is it," he frowned, trying to decide how best to proceed. The Lorkon wouldn't have left the building completely unguarded, he was sure of that. Then Dmitri remembered that Kenji had special abilities. "Can you check to see if there are any living creatures around us?" Kenji nodded, his face brightening. "Yes." He peered out the window, then pulled his head back inside. "There's a bush just outside the door, not as powerful as a tree, but it'll still work." Dmitri motioned for Kenji to go. "I'll keep a lookout." Kenji crouched low by the door and pulled it open, then jumped behind the bush. Dmitri watched with interest as the Mikalo put his left hand against one of the bigger branches and closed his eyes. A moment later, he opened them. There are Dusts and Yuns patrolling the streets around the center. It'll be tough, but not impossible, to get past them. "Did you see a good way to go?" "Yes, follow me." Kenji jumped out from behind the bush and dashed around the corner of their building. Dmitri followed, keeping low. Kenji led him past a couple of buildings and down an alley, where they had a view of the town center and the Yuns and Dusts that surrounded it. The building had decorations all over it, a trident with a sun over its base, which was the symbol the Shingols used to represent themselves. "What would they want with Dusts?" Kenji asked in a whisper. Dmitri watched one of the little beasts with fascination. He'd only seen a couple of them before and was still getting used to the 3-foot-tall creatures whose hands changed into whatever they needed In this case, the dust's hands were formed like a small bucket and shovel. It appeared to be searching for a place to start digging. "I'm not sure. I always thought the things were useless." "Same." Kenji peeked at the little creatures. "The yuns, however, have a purpose." Dmitri nodded. He was very familiar with the three-armed animals. Barely the size of a small cat, they walked on hind legs and used their two main hands to open and get into things. Their third arm was on their back, near the base of the spine, facing forward like a scorpion tail. Its main function was to sense magic and how to break it. This father had used them all the time to access private and magically sealed locations. Maybe the Lorcon are trying to find the secrets of the Shengos. Genji snorted. "And I say, good luck with that." Dmitri turned. "Okay, dusts and yuns. Yuns are no danger to us. We can get past them easily enough. And depending on how well the dusts have been trained, we shouldn't have a problem with them either." "They can be trained?" Genji nodded. "One-on-one, they're not a problem. But in large groups, they could actually prove to be a challenge. A small one, mind you." "You'll have to fill me in on the particulars later," Dmitri said. "For now, we need to find a way around them." "We've got the key, why not just use it to gain access to the town center?" Dmitri felt his face light up. "That's a great idea. I forgot about it." He turned away and strode down the alley, pulling the key out as he approached a door. He put the key into the lock, said, "August Fortress Town Center," turned the key to the left, and slowly pushed open the door. The town center was well lit, which surprised Dmitri. He'd been expecting shadows and monsters and traps to keep him from finding his bride. And it was completely empty. He held the door open for Kenji, then shut it quietly behind them, putting his back to it and getting his bearings. The room before them was probably not as amazing as the actual fortress would have been, but it was still majestic. The sun trident adorned nearly every surface. Tapestries on the walls bore the same symbol, and the dark woods and light stone of the furnishings and walls complemented each other. "Aldo said she'd be in one of the back rooms, right?" Kenji asked. "Right? Should we separate?" Dmitri shook his head. "No, I don't want to run the risk of not being able to find each other later." He glanced at Kenji. "What sorts of other things can you do as a Makalo?" Kenji's expression dampened. "Not much, actually. I wasn't one of the lucky ones. I didn't inherit a lot of the magic most Makalos pass through their generations. I can light my finger, though, if I concentrate really hard on it." "We'll keep that in mind," Dmitri said, "in case the lights go out." He led Kenji to the left, opening the first door they came to, which revealed a long hallway with many more doors leading from it. "I suggest we be systematic, searching each room one at a time, and any rooms attached as we find them." Kenji nodded, and they started. About halfway down the hall, Dmitri heard a scuttling noise behind them. He spun and saw a yun entering the hall. The creature stopped, staring at the two with its huge, luminous eyes. The arm on its back froze in place, pointing at them. Then the thing started chittering noisily and scurried out of the room. "Uh-oh," Dmitri said. "I get the feeling it's not going to help us." Kenji wrung his hands. "Probably not." Just then, a siren sounded throughout the town center. It blasted along the hall, nearly deafening Dmitri. He made eye contact with Kenji, then the two ran as fast as they could, popping doors open, trying to search the hall before reinforcements arrived. The last door revealed a narrow room with a staircase at the end. Closing the door behind them, the two dashed across the room and were about to start up the stairs when Early appeared with a flash and delivered a message from Aldo. "Things aren't looking good. The war has started and hundreds have died already. The Lorcon only arrived a couple of minutes ago, but it seems they are undefeatable. And Kelson and his group have come into a few problems. It looks like they're struggling with something, though Aldo isn't sure what. Also, the Lorcon leader is doing something in the city, placing things all over. Again, Aldo doesn't know for what purpose." Dmitri thanked Early for the message. "Please keep the updates coming." "That doesn't sound good," Kenji said after Early left. Dmitri shook his head. They had to find Aryan before anything more happened. Along with the desire to rescue his wife, he felt a strong urge to hurry and help his friends. They dashed up the stairs and burst through a door at the top, revealing a small hallway. The siren blared even more loudly. The hall was filled with dust. Dmitri jerked to a stop. The creatures surrounded one of the doors at the end, barring passage. They snarled, but remained motionless, long-fingered hands at their sides. "Oh, dusts," Kenji said. "This'll be easy." Dmitri hesitated. "Hope so." He waited several seconds more, but the dusts didn't do anything. "Let's go." He pulled his sword out of its sheath, and Kenji drew a dagger. They looked at each other, then charged down the hall toward the dusts, yelling. Just then, the hands of the dusts in front of the group changed into huge shields. Dusts behind them changed their hands into long spears, which protruded between the shields, and dusts at the very back suddenly held swords. Dmitri and Kenji skidded to a halt before reaching the creatures. "Wow," Dmitri said. "I think they've been trained." "Definitely. I've never seen dusts organize themselves like this before." Dmitri took in a breath. "All right, let's get started." With the clash of weapons, the two jumped in between the dusts, Dmitri barely avoiding getting stabbed by a couple of spears. He was right. These dusts knew how to handle and hold weapons, but even though they were formidable in a group this large, they were still no match for a fully trained adult, and Dmitri was that. With a roar, he swung his sword around, swiping and knocking dusts out of the way as he charged for the door. He blocked and parried with the creatures, keeping his back to Kenji, who fought on the other side. One by one, the dusts started falling. With a flash of light, Aldo appeared next to Dmitri. "You must hurry! Aldo says to hurry!" Without further explanation, the Minya disappeared, and Dmitri and Kenji fought faster and harder. With one final push, they reached the door, the hall behind them littered with injured and dead dusts. Dmitri unlatched the door and shoved it open. The inside of the room was dark, and he had to wait a moment for his eyes to adjust. When they did, he saw a feminine figure huddled against the opposite wall. Aryan. He rushed around the furniture and dropped to his knees next to her, cradling her in his arms. Her body trembled. She looked up at him, eyes bloodshot, auburn hair plastered to her head. "Dmitri?" With a gasp, she reached one hand around his neck and pulled herself closer, the other arm holding a small bundle. "Oh, my Dmitri." "I'm here, love. Are you all right? And the baby?" "Fine. We're both fine. Just, exhausted." Dmitri kissed her forehead, tears springing to his eyes. "You're safe now." She cleared her throat and motioned to the other side of the room. Dmitri jumped to his feet and whirled. Kenji had fallen unconscious in the doorway, blood on his forehead. Had he been injured that badly by the dusts? A huge man Dmitri hadn't noticed earlier stood near the door, looking down at Kenji with, what was it? Concern? Confusion? Dmitri squinted. This man looked like Bren's older brother. "Pharaon?" The man turned and grinned at Dmitri, then stepped into the light filtered through the only window. "Pharaon, it is you!" Dmitri put his sword away. "We searched for you everywhere in my walled city. How'd you get here before we did? You must have really pushed your horse." He laughed. "Either way, I'm really grateful you're here. We could definitely use your help." Dmitri turned back to Aryan. "It's time to get you and the babe out of here." "I'm not going to let that happen," Pharaon said, his voice deep and rough. Dmitri snorted. "Right. Come on, let's get back home. Your home won't be open for you. The Lorcan plan to invade again, permanently, take up residence in the castle." "They'd better not." Dmitri frowned. "And how do you know this?" He circled around a table in the center of the room, approaching Kenji. He knelt by the Makalo's side and checked his pulse. He was fine, thank goodness. "The Lorcan told me, of course. They have access to amazing powers, Dmitri. And not just that, but ancient training and arts long lost on our world." Dmitri paused when Pharaon called him by name. The man had never done that before. It had always been "Your Highness" or "Sire." Dmitri got to his feet and found his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Something about Feron's attitude made him nervous. The man was cocky by nature, but this was more than that. "Feron, tell me, how did you get here so quickly? It's not obvious to you." Dmitri closed his eyes, realizing how stupid he'd been. "I'm hoping it's not what I think it to be." Feron snorted. You can think whatever you want. I'm in a much better place than I was while under your rule." "I didn't rule you," Dmitri said softly. "And neither did King Roylance. You know that." Feron's face clouded over. Then he shook his head. "When the Lorcan approached me several months ago, as you've known that long this would be happening?" The man continued louder. "When they approached me several months ago, they promised many things, and they followed through on those promises. What could you possibly gain from them that you didn't already have?" "Knowledge, Dmitri. Knowledge." Dmitri scoffed. "You had access to all the libraries of the kingdom through your post at the castle. I'm not talking about the kind of stuff King Roylance kept around." Feron picked up an odd-looking light blue and gold shield that rested against the wall behind him. He held it, gazing on it with a fondness Dmitri had never seen a man give an object before. "They taught me ancient fighting techniques, introduced me to weapons long since abandoned, like this." He hefted the shield, and Dmitri was shocked to see that the entire top edge of it had been sharpened and lined with spikes. Not only that, but each corner of the shield was carved into a thick hook, large enough to encircle a man's neck. Feron put the shield down. "And they promised to turn me into one of them, giving me immortality and endless strength." Dmitri shook his head. "You don't even know what you're playing with." "Don't I?" Feron spread his fingers wide. "I've had plenty of time to think about this, to plan things with them." "It was he who led the Lorcan to our chambers," Arian said from where she sat with the babe. "He ensured the entire castle was empty and quiet, so I wouldn't know the Lorcan were on their way, so I wouldn't go into labor prematurely, putting myself at risk." Dmitri glared at Feron. "How dare you do this? How dare you turn your back on people who care about and love you?" "Love?" That was always something Brent sought. Genji stirred from the doorway, and Dmitri tried to warn him with his eyes, but the Makalo was already on alert. Dmitri directed his attention back to the former castle guard. "I'm taking my wife and child with me, now." Feron shrugged. "Go ahead. Try." He lifted his shield again and pulled out his short sword Dmitri knew hadn't come from Maveril City. "I was charged with protecting Princess Ariane from the moment I joined the King's Guard. Imagine my surprise and pleasure at learning I'd be guarding her again, but against my former employer." Dmitri growled, and Kenji lifted his dagger. "I think it's time we put a stop to his ridiculous treason, Your Majesty." Kenji said. "I agree." Dmitri and Kenji lunged at the same time, but to Dmitri's shock, instead of engaging, Feron threw his sword at the prince, and Dmitri barely blocked it with his own. Why would the man throw it? How good would he be in a fight without a sword? But then he lifted his shield, using a circular motion which knocked Kenji back, and jumped for Dmitri. He intended to use it as a weapon. It took Dmitri several moments to adjust to dodging and striking away a shield instead of a sword. Luckily, Kenji was also attacking Feron from the other side, in a blind spot. That kept the guard occupied while Dmitri relearned some of his fighting tactics. It became apparent that Feron hadn't been practicing with a shield for very long, but his training in other areas kept him a dangerous man. His sheer size was a deterrent. He towered over Dmitri by 1.5 feet, maybe 2, and the man had at least 100 pounds on Dmitri, and he was fully armored, while Kenji and Dmitri only had a few pieces of hardened leather covering their torsos. Even fighting 2 opponents, Feron thwarted both their efforts. His reach and the length of his weapon kept them out of range to counterattack, and he always had the shield between himself and one of them while attacking the other. Feron turned on Dmitri again, and the king rolled to the ground to avoid being hooked around the neck by the shield. The whoosh of air above him said he'd barely gotten out of the way in time. Kenji jumped at the guard, holding out his dagger, but the man blocked the blow and spun, knocking Kenji away. Twisting again, he thrust the shield toward Dmitri's neck. Again, Dmitri rolled, getting out of the way just in time. He sprang to his feet, holding his sword with both hands. How to beat this monster? Something his first trainer taught him popped into his mind. Don't use just your weapons. Make use of the objects, furniture, decorations, etc. around you. Switching to a one-handed grip on his sword, Dmitri picked up a chair and swung it at the guard. The wood splintered and shattered, vibrating in Dmitri's hands. But Feron didn't even pause as Kenji advanced on him again. He hooked the Makalo around the ankle and yanked back, hard. Kenji flew to the ground, smacking his head against the stone floor. The sound of the impact echoed off the rafters. Ouch! This was going on far too long. Dmitri growled and rushed Feron, sword up, and nearly stabbed Feron in the chest, but the bigger man was surprisingly fast. He used the hook on his shield again to swipe Dmitri's feet out from under him, and Dmitri fell with a thud, realizing he'd been stopped by a tactic he'd witnessed just seconds earlier. He felt like an idiot. Feron laughed and dashed at Dmitri, holding the shield up, ready to strike. But Kenji had recovered enough to throw his dagger. It struck between the pieces of the man's armor, on the back of the leg, and he roared with rage, whirling to the Makalo. He gripped the dagger and flung it across the room, the veins popping out on his forehead. Dmitri got to his feet and jabbed Feron from behind, but the metal of the guard's armor prevented the sword from penetrating. How would they defeat this man? He was unstoppable. Dmitri shook himself, thinking that way wouldn't help. He needed to find a better way to fight. He became aware of his screaming baby and pushed the thought of his wife and child far from his mind. They would only distract him, definitely placing himself and them in more danger. He put his mind and heart back into the fight, realizing Feron had just knocked Kenji down again. Dmitri jumped forward right as Feron raised his shield. He slid his sword through one of the hooks, yanking back as hard as he could. Feron kept his grasp on the weapon, but nearly fell. Dmitri pulled his sword free. Feron teetered for a moment, and Dmitri took advantage of the imbalance to strike. He put all his weight into the forward motion, aiming the tip of his sword for Feron's heart. The sword barely punctured the armor, but the force of the attack knocked Feron off his feet. With a clatter, he fell to the ground. Dmitri rushed to attack again, but the man recovered quickly. He rolled away and flicked up to a standing position. Feron lifted his shield, and he and Dmitri parried back and forth, dodging furniture, throwing vases and glasses at each other, and whatever else they could get their hands on. Dmitri put his all into the fight. He briefly wondered what had happened with Kenji, but he couldn't risk a glance in the Makalo's direction. A 1-second distraction like that would put him in a weakened state, giving Feron the opportunity to get in a deadly strike. The sound of his baby's cry reached his ears again over the clatter of the fight, and Dmitri renewed his vigor, pushing Feron back. The ringing of his sword matched the volume of the screaming child. But Feron was stronger. Even using 2 hands on his sword, Dmitri barely deflected the attacks. It didn't take long for him to realize he might never gain the upper hand against the guard. He barely dodged a decapitating blow, taking a slash to the shoulder instead. It stung, slowing him down. Feron backed Dmitri into a corner between a bookshelf and a wall and thrust his shield at Dmitri's chest. The corners of the shield, however, struck the wall and bookshelf on either side of Dmitri, and he slid out from under it, rolling away. Feron growled, yanked his shield back, and whirled. The parrying continued. The fight went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. What would cause Feron to fall? Dmitri tried to think of everything he knew about the man, but nothing came to mind. Feron had been perfect in everything he'd learned. From what Dmitri had heard, he was at the top of every class, far outreaching the other students. He had to have a weakness. But Dmitri realized with shock that finding the weakness might not matter. With Kenji apparently out of the fight and his strength waning, it appeared Ferron was about to win. And when Ferron struck Dmitri to the ground, he was convinced of this. Ferron flipped his shield upside down, and before Dmitri could roll far enough away, he stabbed the tip of it deep into Dmitri's thigh. Pain, stronger than his adrenaline, radiated from his leg, coursing through his body. Arian screamed and rushed forward. Dmitri shouted, "Arian, stay away!" Ferron raised his shield, ready to strike again, but just then Kenji jumped back into the fight with his dagger. He struck Ferron in the chest, where the tip of Dmitri's sword had broken the armor. Ferron's eyes widened, and he stared down at the dagger. With a roar, he pulled it loose. It hadn't inflicted enough damage, and raised the shield again. But Early flitted into the room. "Stop!" Early shrieked. And surprisingly, Ferron did. Early continued as soon as she saw she had everyone's attention. "Dead. Slaughtered. All of them. Kelson, Brend, everyone. Kelson? Dead?" It wasn't possible. Ferron dropped his shield. It fell on top of Dmitri, cutting his leg again. Ferron's attention was elsewhere. He turned to Early. "My brother is dead? I won't believe it!" He lunged for the Minya, but Early was much faster and flitted out of reach. Kenji jumped to his feet, dashed to where the shield had fallen and hefted it, knocking Ferron over the head with it. Heron fell to the ground, motionless for the first time. Dmitri tried to get up. He could tell he was losing too much blood from his injuries, and he struggled to maintain consciousness. I'm... He slipped away. Like Janice. Arian's voice brought him back. "You're not going anywhere," she yelled. "Not now. We've just found each other again." She put her hand on the side of his face, staring into his eyes. "Stay with me, Dmitri." But he couldn't. He felt his consciousness slipping again. Then a burning sensation started in his thigh, spreading outward, clearing his mind briefly. He struggled to a sitting position and saw that Kenji had cut open his pants around the large wound and was holding a piece of cloth to it. "I had a little kaide sap with me still," Kenji said, glancing at Dmitri. Blood seeped from a cut on the Mikalo's forehead. "It's not enough to heal you, but enough to give you a slight boost. There's more in my saddle back at Aldo's cabin." With a flash, Early entered the room again. Dmitri didn't even see the Minya leave. "Aldo says to hurry, the Lorcom leader is on his way." Dmitri dragged himself to his feet, Ariane by his side, one arm around him, the other holding their baby, who had finally fallen asleep. Ferron stirred on the ground. "He's not dead," Dmitri said. "I'm afraid not," Kenji said. "It wasn't a fatal blow." Dmitri pulled the key out of his pocket and put it into the lock. Blackness closed over him again, and again Arian called him back. He'd fallen to the ground by the door. With Ariane's help, he dragged himself to his knees and put the key into the lock again. Then he turned it to the left and said, "Aldo's cabin." Ariane put her hand over the doorknob, and together they pulled it open. Aldo's roughly put-together furniture greeted them. Arms around each other, Dmitri and Ariane stumbled through the doorway. With a final burst of energy, Dmitri helped Ariane to the floor of the cabin and turned to make sure Kenji had followed. Then, right as Ferron rolled for the door, arms outstretched, he closed the link. Dmitri sank to the floor next to Ariane, and they cradled each other in their arms. He looked down at the baby, still sleeping. "I'm so very sorry I missed the birth," he said. His eyes shut without his permission, and he fought to open them again. Kenji waved as he left the cabin, and Dmitri turned his attention back to his wife. Ariane shook her head, looking up at her husband, eyes sparkling with unshed tears. "You're here now?" The next several moments were hazy. Kenji returned and started mixing things at the table, then approached Dmitri and dipped a bunch of cloth into a bowl. A sharp pain flooded through Dmitri's leg, and full consciousness returned. Kenji had started wrapping his wound. Ariane was by his side, holding his hand. He traced a finger along her face, peace filling his heart. "What happened when they took you?" he asked, his voice heavy with grief. She shook her head. I remember hardly anything. There were brief moments when I was aware of what was going on, but for the most part, they kept me drugged until I was with the Schengels. The Schengels cared for me, gave me strength, in their own ways. She leaned against Dmitri's shoulder, and Dmitri brushed her hair aside. She took a deep breath. But then I went into labor, and the Lorcan removed me from the fortress. They took me to the town center and helped me deliver the baby. I was surprised at how gentle they were, with both of us. They were gentle? She nodded. They want something from us, but never told me what. I don't know if they got it or not, but they left me alone with the baby fairly quickly after the birth. Early came with a message from Aldo saying that the elderly man was on his way back from his lookout point. Also, Lars and Brujan send messages. Thousands and thousands are dying. They are no match for the Lorcan armies. Arian stifled a sob. So much death. My people, Dmitri. A sudden memory returned to Dmitri. Earlier. He hesitated in saying it, hoping he'd heard wrong. Did you say Kelison was dead? Early nodded her tiny head. No, Dmitri gasped. Immense grief crushed down on him, knocking the wind from his lungs. Kelson, my friend. He couldn't stop the tears that poured down his face. The pain in his heart was physical, more than he could bear. Arian was right. So many people dead. Good people who had been true to Dmitri, King Roylance, Ezra, Brend, and Kelson. Oh, Kelson. Arian held him close and they cried together for several moments. Just as Dmitri felt like he'd finished, a memory of Kelson would surface and the tears would come back again. His best friend since childhood was gone. Finally, the tears ended and Dmitri looked at his wife. The stress and worry of the past several days showed on her face, but she gave him a shaky smile, putting a hand on his cheek. Engi cleared his throat. It looked like he'd also been crying. Early needs orders for the armies. I can start campaigning. Use the ports. I'll ring the legionaries and send them here. Dmitri spotted Early in the air above him, and sure enough, the Minya looked like she was nervously waiting for a message to deliver. Could you give me the report again? Dmitri asked. The Lorcan can't be defeated. The armies need to know what you would have them do. Dmitri nodded and pushed his emotions aside. Tell them to call off the attack. Retreat. Do whatever it takes to avoid total destruction. Dmitri got to his feet and tried to pace before realizing his leg wouldn't allow it. He quickly lost whatever strength he'd found and leaned against the cabin wall for support. Also, tell Brojan and Lars to recruit more, gather a much larger army, but more importantly, instruct them, especially Brojan, to research the Lorcan. Find out anything they can about this evil foe. Early disappeared, and Kenji helped Dmitri sit at the table. Arian joined them. It's the best we can do, Kenji said. We don't know enough about the Lorcan to be effective. Dmitri nodded and pulled Arian closer. He didn't ever want to have her outside of arm's reach again. Arian, my love, your parents. His voice cracked, and he had to pause to take a breath. The dead? Arian's big blue eyes looked at him, worry and pain written there. He nodded. Your father, at least, and we haven't heard from the Queen in a long time. He paused, watching her reactions. I think she's gone as well. The Lorcan attacked the castle again after you'd been taken away. Her eyes filled with tears, but surprisingly they didn't spill over. She nodded. I feared the worst when I realized what was going on. I thought my parents had been killed during the kidnapping. She dropped her voice to a whisper. I thought all of you were dead. Dmitri could see the pain in her eyes. She'd suffered a great deal already. He kissed her, wanting to take that pain away. I will never leave your side again. Nor I yours, she said. Dmitri held her tightly, finding respite in their promise. Dmitri kissed his sleeping baby's hand, tucking it back where it had laid against Arian's side. They both were resting now. Dmitri knew he should be also. but his heart wouldn't stop recalling the events of the past few days. He knew he'd never forget what his best friend had done for them. If he could find a way to repay, to thank Kelson, he would, because nothing could remove the joy he felt as he snuggled his wife and little baby, safely returned to him. All the heartache of the past few days would eventually subside, but the peace and happiness were there to remain, rising in his chest each time he looked on them. Ariane stirred, glancing up at Dmitri, worry on her face. "You can't sleep?" Dmitri shook his head. "Too much on my mind." Ariane nodded, her eyes straying to their baby. She spoke in a whisper. "I've never felt such love for a living being before." Dmitri's gaze didn't leave his wife's face. "Nor I," he said. He trailed a finger down her cheek, kissing her there, then on the shoulder. "We'll find a safe place to live. I'll protect you, never let you come in harm's way again. Not from these Lorcan or any other beast or villain. I promise." Ariane grasped his hand, looking into his eyes. She didn't respond, but Dmitri didn't need her to. The answer and the love she felt were there, written on her face. The end. This has been Stolen Princess, a Kilenya Chronicles story by Andrea Pearson. Thank you for listening.